The fields outside Poniatowa are quiet. There are no towering gates now. No rows of barracks cutting across the landscape. No roll calls echoing in the morning air. And yet, between 1941 and 1943, this place became part of a system designed with precision. Poniatowa began as a prisoner of war camp. Later, it became a forced labor camp for Jewish men and women brought from across occupied Poland and beyond. Workshops operated here. Barracks filled. Lists were recorded. And then, in November 1943, during what the SS called Aktion Erntefest, Operation Harvest Festival, the camp was destroyed. Thousands were killed in a single coordinated action that also took place at Majdanek and Trawniki. Poniatowa did not evolve gradually toward its end. It was eliminated. In this documentary, we will trace the full history of Poniatowa, from its construction, to its role in forced labor, to its destruction during Operation Harvest Festival, and finally to what remains today. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In&Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters. And together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1. The rural landscape before transformation. Long before Poniatowa became connected to forced labor, mass execution, and the administrative structure of Aktion Reinhard, it existed as a modest rural settlement in the Lublin district of eastern Poland, defined by agricultural cycles, local commerce, and the steady patterns of community life that shaped much of the region prior to the Second World War, where cultivated fields extended outward from clusters of homes built in wood and brick, where narrow roads linked villages to nearby towns, such as Lublin and Opole Lubelski, and where forests marked natural boundaries rather than political ones, forming a landscape that appeared stable, measured, and continuous across generations. And within this setting, Polish Catholic and Jewish residents lived in proximity, participating in markets, maintaining workshops, observing religious traditions, and contributing to a social structure that reflected both diversity and interdependence. As Jewish families often engaged in trade, tailoring, and small-scale enterprise while Polish farmers cultivated surrounding land, creating an economy rooted in local exchange rather than industrial production. And though the town was not large, it shared in the broader cultural rhythms of eastern Poland, where harvests determined tempo, where church bells and synagogue gatherings structured time, and where news traveled gradually along established routes rather than arriving through sudden upheaval. Yet this apparent continuity was disrupted in September 1939 when German forces invaded Poland, initiating occupation policies that would gradually reshape towns and districts into components of a centralized administrative system known as the general government. And under this arrangement, the Lublin district became subject to German civil administration reinforced by SS and police authority, bringing with it new regulations, surveillance measures, and strategic planning that extended into rural areas previously distant from large-scale military activity. And during the early months of occupation, the countryside around Poniatowa did not immediately undergo dramatic change, but the broader context of war soon altered its trajectory, particularly after June 1941 when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union, resulting in the capture of vast numbers of Soviet soldiers whose detention required the rapid construction of prisoner-of-war camps across occupied territories, prompting German authorities to survey available land in the Lublin district capable of supporting such facilities, and Poniatowa's outskirts offered practical advantages, including open fields suitable for barack construction, access to regional road networks, and relative separation from major urban centers, allowing for controlled confinement without significant disruption to transportation lines. And by late 1941, construction began on a prisoner-of-war camp designed to hold Soviet captives, marking the first major alteration of the landscape, as wooden barracks were erected in ordered rows upon ground that had once supported agriculture. Perimeter fencing was installed to establish clear boundaries, Guard towers were positioned to oversee internal pathways, and administrative offices were set up to manage registration and supervision, imposing geometric structure upon terrain previously defined by irregular cultivation patterns, and the early population of the camp consisted largely of Soviet prisoners captured during the Eastern Campaign, many of whom arrived in weakened condition and were subjected to policies that provided limited food, minimal shelter, and inadequate medical care, contributing to high mortality during the winter of 1941 and early 1942, a phase that embedded the site within the machinery of occupation before its later transformation into a Jewish forced labor camp. And though this initial stage is often overshadowed by the events of November 1943, it is significant because it established the physical infrastructure that would remain central to subsequent policy shifts, demonstrating how occupation authorities repurposed installations rather than constructing entirely new complexes when directives changed. And while the surrounding countryside continued its seasonal rhythm beyond the perimeter, with fields cultivated and villages inhabited, the enclosed compound had already been integrated into a wider system of military detention and administrative control, and as 1942 progressed, German policy toward Jewish populations in occupied Poland intensified through Aktion Reinhard, which established extermination centers at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, while also organizing forced labor camps to extract economic value from selected prisoners. And within this evolving framework, Poniatowa's existing infrastructure presented a ready foundation for conversion, illustrating how administrative continuity linked phases of occupation policy, because the barracks, fencing, and guard structures required only reclassification and expansion rather than complete reconstruction. And thus the land that had been enclosed for Soviet POW detention would soon be reassigned under SS authority for Jewish forced labor, marking another transformation of purpose without altering the fundamental geometry imposed upon the ground. And by examining this early stage, we see that Poniatowa's later role in Operation Harvest Festival did not emerge from empty terrain but from a site already embedded within the structures of occupation, where the quiet rural fields of eastern Poland had been redefined through measured administrative decision, connecting this modest settlement to the broader network of camps and policies that would shape its history in the years to follow. Chapter 1, Segment 2. From Prisoner of War Camp to Forced Labor Installation. By early 1942, the site at Poniatowa had already been altered once, having shifted from open agricultural terrain into a structured prisoner of war camp for captured Soviet soldiers. Yet the transformation of its purpose was not complete, because the broader policies unfolding within the Lublin district would soon redirect the camp toward a different population and a different function. And to understand this shift, it is necessary to look beyond the fences and examine how occupation authorities in the general government adapted existing infrastructure to serve evolving strategic and ideological goals. As the German invasion of the Soviet Union had produced an immense flow of prisoners requiring detention, but as the Eastern Campaign continued and the machinery of Aktion Reinhardt intensified during 1942, the emphasis within the Lublin district increasingly centered on the systematic destruction of Jewish communities combined with selective exploitation of labor deemed temporarily useful for military production, and under the authority of Odilo Globoknik as SS and police leader in Lublin, extermination centers such as Belzec and Sobibor were established for the immediate killing of deported Jews, while at the same time a network of forced labor camps emerged to extract economic value from those who were not initially sent directly to extermination sites. And within this framework, Poniatowa's physical layout, originally constructed for Soviet POW detention, presented practical advantages for conversion because the barracks were already in place, the perimeter fencing defined boundaries of confinement, and guard towers provided surveillance capacity, requiring only administrative reclassification and internal reorganization to accommodate a new prisoner population. And by mid to late 1942, decisions were made to transform Poniatowa into a Jewish forced labor camp under SS control, linking it directly to the economic apparatus that sought to utilize skilled workers from liquidated ghettos before final elimination. And this transformation was not abrupt in visual terms, as the geometric order imposed upon the land remained intact, But the human composition within the fences changed, with Jewish men and women arriving in transports from dismantled communities, including a significant number transferred from the Warsaw Ghetto following mass deportations and the suppression of resistance there, and upon arrival prisoners were registered, assigned numbers, and allocated to barracks according to administrative categories that prioritized labor capacity over family unity, reflecting the systematic reduction of individuals to functional units within a broader economic scheme, and workshops were established within the camp, particularly focused on textile production for the German military, as sewing machines, cutting tables, and storage racks were installed in adapted barracks to produce uniforms and related garments, integrating the camp into supply chains that extended far beyond the rural fields of Poniatowa, and daily life within this reorganized installation followed structured routine, beginning with roll call assemblies at dawn where prisoners stood in rows to be counted and recounted against administrative records, followed by long hours of labor under supervision, and concluding with evening roll call before confinement to overcrowded barracks where ventilation was limited and rations insufficient. Yet the continuity of routine created an appearance of stability that masked the fragility of the camp's existence, because the same administrative hierarchy that authorized its conversion into a labor site retained the authority to redefine its function at any time, and the surrounding countryside remained outwardly unchanged, with fields cultivated and villages inhabited beyond the perimeter, creating a contrast between ordinary rural continuity and the enclosed system of forced labor inside the camp. And this duality underscored how occupation policy could insert structured confinement into otherwise familiar landscapes without altering the broader geography, and by late 1942 and into 1943 Poniatowa had become one of the larger Jewish labor camps in the Lublin district, holding thousands of prisoners engaged in textile production that temporarily aligned economic exploitation with ideological objectives. Yet this alignment was contingent rather than permanent, shaped by calculations at higher levels of SS leadership influenced by military developments on the Eastern Front and concerns over resistance activity. And thus the conversion of Poniatowa from a prisoner of war camp into a Jewish forced labor installation illustrates how the physical infrastructure of occupation remained constant while the categories of those confined shifted according to policy, embedding the camp more deeply within the evolving system of Aktion Reinhard, and setting the stage for the decisive events that would unfold in November 1943, when the same fences and barracks that had structured months of labor would frame a final transformation of purpose directed from beyond the fields that had once defined Poniatowa's rural character. Chapter 1, Segment 3. The Camp Within the Rural Horizon. By late 1942 and into 1943, Poniatowa had fully assumed its role as a Jewish forced labor camp within the administrative structure of the Lublin district. Yet despite the profound transformation that had occurred within its perimeter, the landscape beyond the fencing remained outwardly consistent with its rural character, and this contrast between enclosed system and open countryside shaped the daily perception of the camp's existence, because from within the barracks prisoners could still see trees, sky, and distant fields that resembled ordinary agricultural life, even as their own movement was confined by barbed wire and guard oversight. And this dual reality underscores how occupation policy did not always require dramatic alteration of geography to impose control, but instead inserted rigid administrative structures into familiar terrain, creating islands of confinement within otherwise continuous landscapes, and inside the camp the infrastructure established during its earlier use as a prisoner of war facility continued to define movement and order, with barracks aligned in rows, internal roads organizing transport of materials, and guard towers positioned at intervals along the perimeter to ensure constant surveillance, while additional modifications were introduced to support textile production, including the installation of sewing machines and cutting tables in adapted wooden structures, storage facilities for fabric and finished garments, and administrative offices responsible for tracking labor quotas and reporting output to higher SS authorities. And the prisoner population, numbering in the thousands, was composed largely of Jews transferred from liquidated ghettos, including a significant group from Warsaw following deportations and the suppression of the 1943 uprising, and these individuals brought with them prior experience of confinement, hunger, and uncertainty, having already endured displacement before arriving at Poniatowa. Yet within the camp's daily routine, a structured rhythm emerged that centered on labor. As roll calls were conducted at fixed hours, work detachments marched to assigned stations, and production targets were measured against expectations communicated through administrative channels, reinforcing the perception that the camp's purpose lay in economic utility rather than immediate extermination, and this perception contributed to a fragile sense among some prisoners that continued productivity might prolong survival, particularly given the known fate of those deported directly to extermination centers such as Treblinka and Sobibor, and yet the alignment between labor and survival remained contingent upon decisions made beyond the camp's fences, because the same administrative system that integrated Poniatowa into military supply chains retained the authority to redefine its function without altering its physical structure. And during this period, the broader Lublin district remained central to Aktion Reinhard operations, with extermination centers having completed much of their killing activity by late 1943 and forced labor camps representing some of the last concentrated Jewish populations in the region, creating a strategic tension between economic exploitation and ideological objective. And while daily life inside Poniatowa followed established routine, subtle signs of change within the district began to emerge, including increased security coordination and shifting priorities as German forces faced mounting pressure on the Eastern Front following defeats such as Stalingrad, prompting concerns within SS leadership about the risks associated with maintaining large Jewish labor populations in areas potentially threatened by advancing Soviet forces. And thus the camp existed within a narrowing corridor of time in which production continued and administrative reports recorded output, even as policy considerations at higher levels moved toward final consolidation, and the surrounding countryside, still cultivated and inhabited, bore silent witness to these developments without visible disruption, reinforcing the contrast between rural continuity and enclosed transformation. And by examining Poniatowa during this phase, we see how the camp functioned as both industrial installation and holding site, embedded within a landscape that did not visibly announce its purpose yet was fully integrated into the occupation system, and this integration illustrates the broader pattern by which Nazi policy operated not only through distant extermination centers but through adaptable facilities that could shift between detention, labor, and elimination according to directive, linking the quiet horizon of Eastern Poland to the administrative decisions that would culminate in Operation Harvest Festival, when the rural fields surrounding Poniatowa would once again frame a decisive redefinition of the camp's function, closing the phase of labor and opening the final chapter of its existence. Chapter 1, Segment 4: Administration, Authority, and Regional Integration. As Poniatowa evolved from a prisoner of war camp into a Jewish forced labor installation, its position within the administrative framework of the Lublin district became more clearly defined, linking the rural compound not only to local oversight but to a broader hierarchy that extended upward through SS and police leadership structures operating across occupied Poland. And understanding this integration is essential to grasp how decisions affecting the camp were made, transmitted, and implemented with coordination rather than improvisation, because while the physical layout of barracks and fencing shaped daily life within the perimeter, authority over the camp derived from offices and command structures situated beyond its boundaries, particularly under the jurisdiction of the SS and police leader in Lublin, Majdanek, who oversaw Aktion Reinhard and the network of camps connected to it, including extermination centers and labor installations alike. And within this hierarchy, Poniatowa functioned as one component in a regional system designed to combine economic exploitation with ideological policy, meaning that its administration involved both camp-level commandants responsible for immediate supervision and district-level authorities who determined overall direction, and the camp commandant, supported by SS personnel and auxiliary guards, managed registration procedures, labor assignments, disciplinary measures, and reporting obligations, ensuring that prisoner numbers, Production quotas and internal conditions were documented in a manner consistent with bureaucratic expectations, while above him regional officials evaluated economic output and security considerations in light of military developments on the Eastern Front. And this layered chain of command meant that changes in policy could be implemented swiftly without restructuring the camp's physical infrastructure, because directives moved downward through established channels and were executed by personnel already positioned within the system, and the integration of Poniatowa into the textile production network further tied it to military supply chains that extended beyond the Lublin district, as garments produced by prisoners were distributed to German forces, reinforcing the perception that the camp's purpose lay in sustained economic utility. And administrative records from this period indicate that thousands of prisoners were registered and categorized according to labor capacity, with skilled tailors and seamstresses assigned to workshops while others performed maintenance, storage, or transport duties, creating an internal division of roles structured by perceived productivity. And this categorization reflected the broader logic of forced labor camps under SS authority, where human beings were evaluated primarily through economic function. Yet this evaluation did not guarantee stability, because the same authorities who measured output also monitored security conditions, resistance activity, and shifting military realities. And by mid to late 1943, concerns within the district about the risks of concentrated Jewish labor populations began to intersect with broader strategic anxieties following German defeats in the East, contributing to reassessment of the continued existence of camps such as Poniatowa, and thus the administrative integration that had once supported economic exploitation would later facilitate coordinated elimination, illustrating how bureaucratic order could serve multiple and sequential objectives without altering its structural form. And within the rural horizon surrounding the camp, this integration remained largely invisible, as villages continued daily routines and fields were cultivated beyond the fences. Yet the decisions shaping the fate of those confined inside were determined through meetings, memoranda, and directives exchanged within a structured hierarchy that connected Poniatowa to Majdanek, Trawniki, and other installations in the region, demonstrating that the camp was never an isolated entity but part of a deliberate and interconnected system. And by examining this administrative framework, we see that the transformation of the landscape in 1941 and 1942 was accompanied by an equally significant embedding of the site within the apparatus of occupation governance, preparing the conditions under which future directives, economic or lethal, could be implemented with coordination across multiple locations, and setting the stage for the decisive action that would redefine Poniatowa's purpose once again in November 1943, when the administrative machinery that had organized labor would organize something final instead. Chapter 1, Segment 5. A Landscape Drawn into Policy. By the autumn of 1943, Poniatowa had been fully absorbed into the administrative and economic structure of the Lublin district, functioning as a large Jewish forced labor camp whose outward appearance remained defined by wooden barracks, fenced perimeters, and guarded entry points, yet whose deeper significance lay in the policy decisions that linked it to the final phase of Aktion Reinhard. And when viewed from the surrounding countryside, the camp did not appear architecturally extraordinary, as its geometry resembled other detention sites constructed across occupied territories. But its importance rested in the concentration of thousands of prisoners within a region that had already witnessed the liquidation of ghettos and the operation of extermination centers such as Belzec and Sobibor, and by this stage the majority of Jewish communities in the Lublin district had been destroyed through deportation and mass killing, leaving forced labor camps like Poniatowa, Trawniki, and sections of Majdanek as some of the last concentrated Jewish populations under SS control in the region, creating a situation in which economic exploitation and ideological policy existed side by side, yet increasingly under tension as German military fortunes declined on the Eastern Front following defeats that altered strategic calculations, and within Poniatowa daily routine continued in structured rhythm, with roll calls marking the beginning and end of work shifts, textile production, maintaining a steady output of uniforms and related garments for the German military, and administrative offices compiling reports that quantified labor performance and prisoner numbers, reinforcing an image of operational continuity. Yet beyond the fences, conversations within the SS hierarchy increasingly focused on security concerns, particularly the fear that large concentrations of Jewish laborers could become focal points for resistance or be liberated by advancing Soviet forces. And this anxiety was heightened by the memory of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising earlier in 1943, which demonstrated that confined populations could organize armed resistance even under severe conditions, prompting regional authorities to reassess the risks associated with maintaining substantial prisoner populations in labor camps. And thus the landscape of Poniatowa, though unchanged in physical form, entered a period of uncertainty shaped not by visible disruption but by shifting calculations within. Higher levels of command and the camp's integration into supply networks no longer guaranteed its continuation, because economic utility could be overridden by strategic or ideological priorities, and the administrative structure that had converted the site from prisoner of war camp to labor installation was equally capable of directing its dissolution, illustrating how continuity of bureaucracy could facilitate abrupt transformation without altering infrastructure. And in the days leading up to November 1943, subtle signs of increased coordination were reported across the Lublin district, including the movement of additional security personnel and preparations at multiple camps. Though for prisoners within Poniatowa the routine of work and roll call provided limited insight into decisions unfolding beyond their immediate environment, and the rural fields surrounding the compound remained outwardly unchanged, their quiet horizon offering no visible indication of impending action. Yet, the camp's fate had already been determined within a structured plan that linked Majdanek, Trawniki, and Poniatowa in a synchronized sequence known as Operation Harvest Festival. And thus the landscape that had once supported agriculture, then prisoner of war detention, and then forced labor production, stood on the threshold of another redefinition of purpose, one that would conclude the camp's active existence in a single coordinated operation. And by tracing this progression we understand that Poniatowa was not transformed suddenly but drawn step by step into policy, each phase building upon existing structures and administrative integration, until the quiet rural ground of eastern Poland became inseparable from the larger narrative of Aktion Reinhard and the final consolidation of killing operations in the Lublin district. Chapter 2, Segment 1. Political Context and the Structure of Occupation. To understand how Poniatowa moved from rural settlement to prisoner of war camp and then to Jewish forced labor installation, it is necessary to step outward from the camp itself and examine the political and administrative framework that shaped the Lublin district after 1939, because the transformation of local landscapes did not occur in isolation but within a structured system of occupation governance that combined civil authority with SS and police power. And when Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the country was divided between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union under the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, leading to the creation of the general government in central and southern Poland as a territory administered by German officials rather than annexed directly into the Reich. And within this administrative entity, the Lublin district emerged as a region of increasing strategic importance, both for its geographic location in eastern Poland and for its suitability as a site of resettlement, detention, and later extermination policies, and the Governor-General, Hans Frank, oversaw the general government from Krakow, but within each district authority was further distributed among civil administrators and SS leadership, creating overlapping structures of power in which police, security services, and occupation officials interacted to implement policy. And in Lublin this structure was shaped decisively by Odilo Globoknik, appointed as SS and police leader, who became central to the planning and execution of Aktion Reinhard, the operation that sought to murder the Jewish population of occupied Poland through deportation to extermination centers and through mass shooting actions. And as these policies unfolded during 1942, the Lublin district became the operational center of extermination efforts, with Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka constructed or expanded to facilitate large-scale killing, while at the same time ghettos in cities such as Warsaw, Lublin, and Radom were liquidated, And in this broader context, labor camps served a complementary function, as occupation authorities selected certain prisoners for temporary economic exploitation rather than immediate deportation, particularly those possessing skills useful to German industry or military supply, and this dual structure of extermination and exploitation required administrative coordination across multiple levels, from transport planning to camp command appointments, and it is within this network that Poniatowa's conversion must be situated, because its transformation from POW facility to Jewish labor camp was not a local improvisation but part of a wider regional strategy in which available infrastructure was evaluated for suitability in serving SS economic interests, and the Lublin district's rural expanses made it particularly adaptable for such purposes, as land could be enclosed, repurposed, and integrated into security systems without major urban disruption. And by 1942, the political environment in the district was characterized by systematic deportations, intensified surveillance, and the gradual elimination of Jewish communal structures, meaning that camps such as Poniatowa operated within an atmosphere of escalating violence even when their daily function centered on production rather than immediate killing. And this context is essential because it reveals that the camp's existence was always provisional, dependent upon calculations made by authorities balancing economic benefit against ideological objective and security concern, and as German military fortunes shifted following setbacks on the Eastern Front in 1943, these calculations increasingly favored consolidation and elimination over continued exploitation, demonstrating how the political structure governing the Lublin district could redirect policy swiftly across multiple sites. And thus Poniatowa's history in late 1943 cannot be separated from the broader political trajectory of occupation in eastern Poland, where decisions issued through layered hierarchies transformed landscapes and populations in accordance with evolving priorities shaped by war, ideology, and administrative design. Chapter 2, Segment 2. Aktion Reinhard and the Logic of Elimination. By 1942, the Lublin district had become the operational center of one of the most systematic phases of the Holocaust, known as Aktion Reinhard, and to understand Poniatowa's place within this framework, it is necessary to examine the structure and logic of this operation, because the camp did not exist independently but within a coordinated regional system designed to eliminate the Jewish population of occupied Poland while extracting labor and property during the process, and under the authority of Heinrich Himmler and implemented locally by Odilo Globoknik, Aktion Reinhard established extermination centers at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, where deported Jews from ghettos across the general government were murdered upon arrival, marking a shift from earlier patterns of persecution and mass shooting toward centralized killing installations specifically constructed for that purpose. And throughout 1942, transports departed from urban ghettos including Warsaw, Lublin, Radom, and smaller towns, carrying thousands to these sites, while the property of deported Jews was systematically confiscated, sorted, and redistributed through administrative channels, reinforcing the bureaucratic character of the operation. And yet, alongside extermination centers, the SS also maintained a network of forced labor camps in which selected individuals were temporarily spared from immediate deportation due to perceived economic usefulness, particularly those with skills in tailoring, shoemaking, metalwork, or other trades essential to military supply, and Poniatowa's transformation into a textile labor camp must be viewed within this dual structure of killing and exploitation, because it served as one of the sites where Jewish prisoners were assembled not for immediate extermination but for sustained production under guard, contributing uniforms and related garments to the German military, and this arrangement reflected a calculated balance between ideological objective and economic need, demonstrating that extermination policy did not eliminate all prisoners at once but proceeded through stages determined by administrative evaluation of labor capacity. And as ghettos were liquidated and deportations continued through late 1942 and early 1943, Poniatowa received transfers of Jewish prisoners who had survived initial selections, integrating them into workshops established within barracks originally built for Soviet POW detention. And the camp thus became a node in the economic dimension of Aktion Reinhard, linked by paperwork, reporting systems, and personnel assignments to the broader apparatus overseen from Lublin, and the existence of such labor camps illustrates how the SS system combines centralized killing centers with decentralized exploitation sites, creating a layered structure in which prisoners could be moved, reassigned, or eliminated according to evolving priorities. And by mid-1943, the majority of Jewish communities in the Lublin district had already been destroyed through deportation, leaving camps such as Poniatowa, Trawniki, and Majdanek holding some of the last substantial Jewish populations under SS control in the region. And this concentration carried implications beyond economics, because it represented both a remaining source of labor and a potential security concern as German military setbacks increased the possibility of territorial loss. And thus the logic of Aktion Reinhardt by late 1943 was shaped not only by ideological commitment to extermination but also by calculations tied to war conditions and fears of resistance, particularly after events such as the Warsaw Ghetto uprising had demonstrated that confined populations could organize armed revolt, prompting reassessment of the risks associated with maintaining large labor camps. And within this shifting framework, the fate of Poniatowa would ultimately be determined, as the same administrative network that had coordinated deportations and labor exploitation prepared a synchronized action known as Operation Harvest Festival to eliminate the remaining Jewish labor camps in the Lublin district, demonstrating that the logic of Aktion Reinhardt evolved toward consolidation and finality once economic utility was deemed secondary to security and ideological objectives. And by examining this broader structure, we see that Poniatowa's trajectory was embedded within a system that linked extermination centers, labor camps, administrative offices, and regional command into a cohesive operation, where decisions flowed downward through established hierarchies and were implemented with coordination across multiple sites, culminating in November 1943 when the balance between exploitation and elimination was resolved through a district-wide action that closed the final chapter of Aktion Reinhardt in eastern Poland. Chapter 2, Segment 3: Security, Resistance, and Shifting Calculations in 1943. As 1943 progressed, the political and military context surrounding the Lublin district began to change in ways that directly affected the future of camps such as Poniatowa. And although the physical layout of barracks, fencing, and guard towers remained constant, the calculations made by German authorities at regional and higher levels grew increasingly influenced by developments beyond occupied Poland, particularly the shifting momentum of the war on the Eastern Front, where German forces suffered major setbacks, most notably at Stalingrad in early 1943, altering strategic expectations and raising concerns about the long-term stability of territories previously considered secure. And within this environment, the presence of large concentrations of Jewish forced laborers in camps across the district was viewed not only through the lens of economic utility but also through the lens of security risk, because the continued advance of Soviet forces created the possibility that camps could be overrun, prisoners liberated, or unrest encouraged by approaching front lines, and these anxieties were reinforced by events earlier in the year such as the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in April 1943, which demonstrated that even populations confined under severe restrictions could organize coordinated resistance when faced with deportation and liquidation, prompting SS leadership to reassess the management of remaining Jewish labor populations. And in the Lublin district, camps such as Majdanek, Trawniki, and Poniatowa held thousands of prisoners who had been retained for production purposes after the liquidation of ghettos, creating a situation in which economic exploitation coexisted with ideological commitment to extermination. Yet as the war situation deteriorated, the balance between these two considerations began to shift, and administrative correspondence within the district reflected heightened emphasis on security coordination, movement of additional guard units, and planning that extended across multiple camps rather than focusing solely on individual installations, indicating that broader measures were under discussion. And although daily life within Poniatowa continued to revolve around textile production and structured routine, with roll calls conducted and labor quotas maintained, the camp's continued operation was increasingly contingent upon decisions shaped by external pressures rather than internal productivity alone. and the existence of large, forced labor populations in a relatively concentrated geographic area of eastern Poland became viewed by some authorities as incompatible with emerging strategic realities, particularly given the lessons drawn from resistance events and the unpredictability of a shifting front. And thus, by late summer and early autumn of 1943, the political climate within the Lublin district was marked by reassessment, with SS leadership evaluating how to consolidate control, eliminate perceived vulnerabilities, and close what they regarded as unfinished aspects of Aktion Reinhard. And within this climate, the groundwork for a coordinated operation began to take shape, linking Majdanek, Trawniki, and Poniatowa in planning discussions that emphasized synchronization and containment, so that actions at one site would not trigger warning or unrest at another, reflecting a calculated approach designed to minimize resistance and maximize control. And while prisoners within Poniatowa may have observed subtle increases in guard presence or shifts in routine, the broader strategic reasoning driving these developments remained confined to administrative channels, illustrating the distance between daily experience inside the camp and the political calculations unfolding beyond its perimeter. And by situating Poniatowa within this evolving security context, we see that its fate was not determined solely by local conditions, but by the intersection of military setbacks, ideological objectives, and administrative capacity within the Lublin district, setting the stage for Operation Harvest Festival, a coordinated action that would resolve the tension between economic exploitation and perceived security risk by eliminating the remaining Jewish labor camps in the region in early November 1943, thereby concluding the final phase of Aktion Reinhard through structured implementation of policy shaped by both wartime developments and long-standing ideological commitments. Chapter 2, Segment 4. Economic Utility and Administrative Illusion of Stability. In the months leading up to November 1943, Poniatowa functioned outwardly as a stable labor installation integrated into the economic machinery of the Lublin district, and this appearance of stability was not accidental but produced through deliberate administrative routine, because the SS system depended not only on force but on documentation, reporting, and structured daily rhythm that conveyed continuity even when long-term intentions were shifting. And inside the camp, the organization of textile production created measurable outputs that were recorded and transmitted through official channels, reinforcing the perception that the camp's existence was justified by military necessity. As thousands of prisoners worked in adapted barracks equipped with sewing machines, cutting tables, and storage racks, producing uniforms and related garments for German forces engaged on multiple fronts, and production quotas were monitored carefully, with supervisors ensuring that labor detachments met expected targets, while administrative offices compiled figures related to workforce size, material distribution, and finished goods, embedding Poniatowa within supply chains that extended far beyond the rural landscape in which it stood. And this integration into economic networks fostered among some prisoners a fragile belief that continued usefulness might delay more severe outcomes, especially given widespread knowledge of extermination centers where those deemed unfit for labor were sent. Yet this perception of conditional security rested upon assumptions that were increasingly uncertain, because by late 1943 the broader strategic environment was changing rapidly, and German defeats on the Eastern Front combined with growing resistance movements in occupied territories prompted reassessment within SS leadership regarding the risks of maintaining large Jewish labor populations in relatively concentrated districts. And while production reports continued to flow upward through bureaucratic channels, parallel discussions within regional command structures began to consider consolidation measures that would override economic calculation, illustrating the dual character of the camp's final months, where outward routine masked internal planning for coordinated action, and the rural setting of Poniatowa intensified this contrast, as beyond the fences agricultural life persisted in apparent normalcy, with fields cultivated and villages functioning according to seasonal patterns, creating a visual separation between enclosed labor and surrounding continuity. Yet within the camp, the regimented rhythm of roll calls, work shifts, and curfews reinforced the impression of ongoing function. even as subtle indicators of heightened security appeared, such as increased guard presence and coordination across camps in the district, and this coexistence of production and preparation reveals how the SS administrative system could sustain an illusion of permanence, while simultaneously planning abrupt transformation, because the same structures that organized labor assignments and recorded output were capable of implementing new directives without altering physical infrastructure. And thus the stability experienced in daily routine did not reflect long-term assurance but temporary alignment between economic and ideological objectives, an alignment that was narrowing as autumn progressed. And examining this period of apparent continuity allows us to understand that Poniatowa's destruction in November 1943 did not interrupt a stable equilibrium but concluded a phase already shaped by tension between exploitation and elimination, demonstrating how bureaucratic order and industrial routine could exist alongside imminent policy shift, and how the measured cadence of production within wooden barracks could give way, within a coordinated plan, to finality directed from beyond the horizon that framed the camp's rural setting. Chapter 2, Segment 5. The Convergence Toward Operation Harvest Festival. By the final weeks of October 1943, the political, military, and administrative currents flowing through the Lublin district began to converge in a manner that would determine the fate of Poniatowa and the remaining Jewish labor camps in the region. And while daily routine within the camp continued to follow structured rhythm, roll calls conducted at fixed hours, textile workshops operating under supervision, production reports compiled and transmitted through bureaucratic channels, the broader strategic environment had shifted in ways that made the continuation of large Jewish labor populations increasingly incompatible with SS priorities, because German forces were facing sustained pressure on the Eastern Front, and the prospect of Soviet advance into occupied Poland was no longer distant or theoretical but an anticipated reality, prompting regional authorities to consider how to secure their position, eliminate perceived vulnerabilities, and conclude what they regarded as unfinished phases of Aktion Reinhard, and the memory of resistance actions, particularly the Warsaw Ghetto uprising earlier in 1943, reinforced concerns within SS leadership about the risks associated with maintaining concentrated groups of prisoners who, under certain circumstances, might organize revolt or disrupt retreat, and thus the camps of Majdanek, Trawniki, and Poniatowa, each holding thousands of Jewish laborers, became subjects of coordinated planning that extended beyond local command structures and into district-level decision-making, where synchronization was emphasized to prevent warning between sites and to ensure that action taken at one location would not produce resistance at another. And this emphasis on coordination reflects the structured character of SS administration, in which directives were prepared in advance, personnel movements organized discreetly, and logistical requirements, such as the preparation of execution trenches and allocation of security units, arranged so that implementation could occur rapidly and with minimal disruption to surrounding areas. And within Poniatowa itself, outward signs of imminent change remained limited, as production continued and barracks remained occupied, reinforcing among prisoners the fragile belief that labor retained protective value. Yet beyond the fences, additional security forces were positioned within the district, and planning connected Poniatowa to actions scheduled at Majdanek and Trawniki, forming a synchronized sequence that would unfold over 2 consecutive days in early November 1943. And this convergence illustrates how the camp's history cannot be understood solely through its internal routine, but must be viewed through the lens of regional policy shaped by war developments and ideological commitments, because the decision to eliminate the labor camps was not spontaneous but the result of calculated assessment within a hierarchy that combined economic evaluation with strategic and racial objectives. And when Operation Harvest Festival was authorized, it represented the final consolidation of Aktion Reinhard within the Lublin district, intended to remove the last substantial Jewish populations under SS control in the area, thereby closing a chapter of extermination policy that had begun with deportations and centralized killing centers in 1942. And thus, as October 1943 drew to a close, the rural fields surrounding Poniatowa remained outwardly unchanged, yet within administrative channels preparations were nearing completion for a coordinated action that would redefine the camp's purpose one final time, transforming it from labor installation to site of mass execution in a single, synchronized operation that linked multiple camps across the district. And by tracing this convergence we see how political context, military pressure, and bureaucratic planning intersected to determine Poniatowa's fate, embedding the camp within the final act of action Reinhard and setting the stage for the events of November 4, 1943, when the structured continuity of months would be replaced by a decisive and coordinated conclusion shaped by the priorities of the occupation regime. Chapter 3, Segment 1. Camp Construction and Physical Layout. When examining Poniatowa as a physical space rather than solely as an administrative entity, the transformation of open rural land into a structured camp reveals how occupation policy translated into material form, because the layout of barracks, fencing, guard towers, and internal roads was not incidental but deliberately arranged to impose order, surveillance, and control upon terrain that had previously been shaped by agricultural patterns, and the initial construction phase in late 1941, when the site functioned as a prisoner of war camp for captured Soviet soldiers, established the essential geometry that would remain in place through subsequent phases, with rows of wooden barracks erected in parallel formation, space to allow regulated movement while preventing unmonitored gathering, and perimeter fencing reinforced with barbed wire enclosing the compound to create a clearly defined boundary between confinement and surrounding countryside, and at intervals along this. Perimeter guard towers were constructed to provide elevated vantage points from which armed personnel could oversee internal activity and monitor attempts at escape, ensuring that the camp's spatial organization reinforced constant observation, while entry and exit points were limited to controlled gates staffed by guards responsible for verifying movement and maintaining records, and within the perimeter internal pathways were laid out to connect barracks to administrative offices, storage areas, and later to workshops adapted for textile production, creating a network of routes that directed the flow of prisoners in measured patterns from roll call assembly areas to labor stations and back again. And when the camp was converted into a Jewish forced labor installation in 1942, this existing infrastructure required modification rather than reconstruction, as additional barracks were constructed or adapted to accommodate increasing prisoner numbers, and certain structures were repurposed as workshops equipped with sewing machines, cutting tables, and storage racks, integrating the camp's layout into an industrial rhythm layered onto the original detention design. And the spatial division within the camp often reflected functional categories, with separate areas for housing, production, administration, and punishment, reinforcing hierarchical distinctions between prisoners and overseers, and the presence of open ground within the perimeter allowed for roll call. Formations where thousands could be assembled and counted, an arrangement central to the maintenance of order and documentation, because accurate prisoner counts were integral to administrative reporting, and the physical environment also shaped daily experience, as overcrowded barracks with limited insulation exposed prisoners to seasonal extremes of temperature, while the visibility of guard towers and fencing created a constant reminder of confinement. Yet beyond these boundaries the rural landscape remained visible, with fields and trees forming a horizon that contrasted sharply with the imposed geometry inside the camp, illustrating how the SS system relied upon clear spatial separation to maintain authority, and the layout of Poniatowa thus embodied the principles of surveillance, regulation, and compartmentalization characteristic of camps in the Lublin district, linking it structurally to other installations such as Trawniki and Majdanek, and this physical framework, established first for Soviet POW detention and later expanded for Jewish forced labor, would ultimately facilitate the final coordinated action of November 1943, because the same open assembly areas, fenced perimeters, and controlled access points that had structured months of labor provided the spatial conditions under which Operation Harvest Festival could be implemented swiftly and in sequence, demonstrating that the camp's architecture was not merely background but an active component of policy execution, shaping how movement was directed, how numbers were recorded, and how authority was exercised within a rural landscape that had been transformed step by step into an instrument of confinement and, ultimately, elimination. Chapter 3, Segment 2. Internal Organization and Functional Zones. Beyond the perimeter fencing and visible guard towers, the internal organization of Poniatowa reflected a deliberate division of space into functional zones that reinforced hierarchy, control, and economic purpose. And while the overall geometry of the camp was defined by rows of barracks aligned in ordered formation, the specific allocation of those structures evolved as the camp shifted from a prisoner of war installation to a Jewish forced labor site, creating a layered environment in which living quarters, production areas, storage facilities, administrative offices, and security points were interconnected through regulated pathways designed to channel movement and limit autonomy. And at the center of daily routine stood the roll call square, an open space large enough to assemble thousands of prisoners at designated hours, where counting procedures were conducted with precision to ensure that registration lists matched physical presence, reinforcing the bureaucratic logic that underpinned the camp's administration. And from this central assembly area, prisoners were directed toward assigned workstations located within adapted barracks converted into textile workshops, where sewing machines were arranged in rows to maximize productivity. Cutting tables were positioned to facilitate systematic processing of fabric, and storage areas were allocated for both raw materials and finished uniforms, integrating the camp's physical layout into the broader supply network serving German military needs. And the housing barracks themselves were arranged in clusters, often separated by narrow lanes that allowed guards to patrol between them while preventing the formation of unobserved gatherings. And these barracks were typically overcrowded, with wooden bunks stacked to accommodate as many prisoners as possible within limited space, reflecting the prioritization of capacity over comfort, while sanitation facilities were positioned at designated points within the compound, further structuring daily movement and reinforcing dependence on regulated schedules. And administrative offices were located near the main gate or within secured sections of the camp, where camp officials maintained records of prisoner numbers, labor assignments, material inventories, and disciplinary actions, creating a paper trail that connected internal organization to district-level reporting structures in Lublin. And the internal zoning of Poniatowa thus mirrored the administrative segmentation of authority, as spatial boundaries corresponded to functional distinctions between labor, residence, oversight, and punishment, and in certain sections additional fencing or restricted access areas separated specific prisoner categories or secured materials, demonstrating how layered confinement operated within the broader enclosure. And the arrangement of guard posts and patrol routes ensured that lines of sight overlapped, minimizing blind spots and reinforcing the principle of constant surveillance, while the surrounding rural environment remained visible beyond the outer fence, a reminder of geographical continuity that contrasted with the strict compartmentalization inside. And this internal organization not only facilitated efficient labor production but also prepared the spatial conditions necessary for rapid reconfiguration should policy demand change, because the central assembly square, controlled gates, and clearly demarcated zones enabled authorities to gather, divide, and direct large numbers of prisoners with minimal structural alteration. And thus the physical layout of Poniatowa cannot be understood as static architecture but as a flexible instrument of administrative control, capable of supporting both economic exploitation and, later, coordinated elimination, illustrating how the segmentation of space within the camp reflected and reinforced the segmentation of authority within the occupation system, embedding policy into wood, wire, and measured pathways across a landscape that had once been defined only by fields and forest. Chapter 3, Segment 3. Surveillance, Boundaries, and the Experience of Confinement. The physical construction of Poniatowa was not limited to barracks and workshops alone, but extended into a carefully designed system of surveillance and boundary enforcement that defined how space was experienced by those confined within it. Because the architecture of control relied not only on visible fencing but on the constant reinforcement of separation between prisoner and surrounding landscape, and the perimeter of the camp was marked by barbed wire stretched along wooden posts, sometimes reinforced with additional layers to discourage escape, forming a continuous boundary that signaled both physical and psychological division from the rural world beyond, while guard towers positioned at intervals along this perimeter provided elevated observation points from which armed personnel could monitor activity across the compound, ensuring that open assembly areas and internal pathways remained under watch, and the presence of these towers altered the visual horizon inside. The camp, as prisoners looking outward saw not only fields and trees, but also the silhouette of surveillance structures standing between them and the open countryside, creating a layered perception in which natural scenery and imposed authority coexisted within the same field of vision, and movement inside the camp was directed through designated routes that minimized unpredictability, with narrow lanes between barracks guiding prisoners from sleeping quarters to roll call square and from roll call to workshops, reinforcing a routine that left little room for deviation, while controlled gates regulated all entry and exit, often accompanied by guardhouses where identification checks and documentation occurred, embedding bureaucratic procedure into physical thresholds, and lighting arrangements where available extended surveillance into evening hours, reducing the possibility of unmonitored movement after work shifts concluded, and this comprehensive system of boundaries shaped daily experience not only by restricting movement but by structuring perception, because prisoners were constantly reminded of enclosure through visible wire, patrol presence, and the awareness that any attempt to cross designated limits would be met with immediate consequence. Yet beyond the fence the landscape remained unchanged, with cultivated fields and village roads continuing in seasonal rhythm, creating a contrast between confinement and continuity that underscored the artificial imposition of the camp upon otherwise ordinary terrain, and this contrast amplified the psychological dimension of boundaries, as the proximity of familiar rural elements did not translate into accessibility, reinforcing the reality that Poniatowa functioned as an isolated zone within a living region, and the layered system of fencing, guard posts, patrol routes, and internal zoning thus formed a comprehensive architecture of control that was both visible and procedural, linking spatial design to administrative oversight, because accurate prisoner counts, labor assignments, and disciplinary enforcement depended upon predictable movement within defined areas. And when the camp's function shifted over time from POW detention to Jewish forced labor, this architecture remained intact, demonstrating its adaptability to new policy directives without fundamental redesign. And ultimately, this structure of surveillance and boundaries would play a decisive role during Operation Harvest Festival, as the same assembly spaces, fenced perimeters, and controlled access points that had regulated months of labor enabled the rapid gathering and containment of thousands within a synchronized operation, illustrating that the camp's physical environment was not merely backdrop but active instrument in the execution of policy, embedding authority into landscape and shaping the lived experience of confinement in ways that extended beyond the visible wire to the regulated pathways and watchful vantage points that defined Poniatowa's spatial reality. Chapter 3, Segment 4: Expansion, Overcrowding, and Structural Adaptation. As Poniatowa's role within the Lublin district expanded during 1942 and into 1943, the physical structure of the camp underwent adaptation rather than complete redesign, reflecting the administrative tendency to build upon existing infrastructure while increasing capacity to accommodate rising prisoner numbers, and this expansion occurred in response to the liquidation of ghettos and the transfer of Jewish prisoners deemed suitable for labor, particularly from Warsaw and other urban centers, resulting in a steady growth of the camp population that required additional housing space, workshop areas, and storage facilities. And because the original layout had been established during its period as a prisoner of war camp, expansion followed the same geometric principles, extending rows of barracks outward from the initial grid, reinforcing the ordered alignment that facilitated surveillance and movement control, while maintaining the central roll call square as the organizing focal point of daily assembly, and new structures were often constructed quickly using available materials, emphasizing function over durability, with wooden walls and simple roofing designed to maximize occupancy rather than comfort, leading to overcrowded conditions inside sleeping quarters where bunks were arranged in stacked formations to fit as many individuals as possible within confined space. And as the number of prisoners increased, so too did the pressure on sanitation facilities, food, distribution systems, and internal pathways, creating a densely packed environment where regulated routine was essential to prevent disorder, and workshops dedicated to textile production expanded accordingly, with additional sewing machines installed and work tables arranged in rows to accommodate growing labor detachments, integrating the camp more deeply into supply chains that extended to German military units, and this expansion was coordinated with district-level authorities who monitored output and labor efficiency, ensuring that the camp's growth aligned with economic objectives even as ideological policy remained in force. And yet the rapid adaptation of space could not conceal the provisional nature of the structures, as barracks built to house increasing numbers were often poorly insulated against seasonal extremes, exposing prisoners to cold winters and humid summers, and the density of occupation within the perimeter heightened awareness of confinement, as narrow lanes between buildings became more crowded and opportunities for privacy diminished further, reinforcing the camp's character as a controlled environment shaped by capacity rather than permanence. And beyond the fencing, the rural landscape remained visually consistent, with fields cultivated and villages inhabited, emphasizing that the expansion of the camp represented an imposed layer upon otherwise continuous terrain, rather than a transformation of the broader geography. And this duality, expanding confinement within stable surroundings, illustrates how occupation policy could intensify without altering the visible horizon, embedding larger numbers of prisoners within the same spatial logic of control. And as 1943 progressed and the camp reached significant population levels, its expanded layout also meant that any coordinated action could be implemented within a prearranged grid, as assembly areas, internal roads, and fenced boundaries were already configured to manage large groups efficiently, demonstrating that structural adaptation not only supported labor exploitation but also inadvertently prepared the spatial conditions under which the camp's final phase would unfold, linking expansion and overcrowding to the later capacity for synchronized elimination. And by examining this stage, we see how physical growth of the camp was inseparable from administrative intention, each additional barrack and workshop reinforcing the integration of Poniatowa into the Lublin district's system of exploitation and control, even as the future of that system was being reassessed at higher levels of authority. Chapter 3, Segment 5. Space as Instrument of Policy. When viewed in its entirety, the physical layout of Poniatowa was more than an arrangement of barracks and fences. It functioned as an instrument through which policy was implemented, adjusted, and ultimately concluded, because the spatial organization of the camp reflected the administrative priorities that shaped its evolution from prisoner of war facility to Jewish forced labor installation and, finally, to a site incorporated into Operation Harvest Festival. And the ordered grid of wooden structures, the clearly defined roll call square, the segmented workshop zones, and the reinforced perimeter fencing created a framework that allowed authority to operate with precision, directing movement, categorizing individuals, and maintaining oversight through predictable spatial patterns. And this predictability was central to bureaucratic control, as accurate prisoner counts depended on the ability to assemble large groups in designated areas. Labor assignments required clearly marked routes between housing and production spaces, and security enforcement relied upon unobstructed lines of sight from guard towers positioned strategically along the boundary, ensuring that no portion of the camp fell entirely outside observation. And the design thus embodied a logic of regulation in which space was compartmentalized into functional sectors: residential, industrial, administrative, and disciplinary, each linked by pathways that both connected and constrained, reinforcing hierarchy and limiting spontaneity, while beyond the perimeter the rural environment continued according to seasonal rhythm, a continuity that sharpened the contrast between enclosed order and open landscape, highlighting how confinement had been inserted into otherwise ordinary terrain, And as the camp expanded during 1942 and 1943, additional barracks and workshops were integrated into the existing grid rather than disrupting it, demonstrating the adaptability of the original design and its capacity to absorb increased population without structural reconfiguration, and this adaptability would later facilitate the rapid execution of coordinated directives, because the same assembly square used for daily roll calls could gather thousands under guard. The same fenced boundaries that prevented escape during labor hours could contain movement during mass operations, and the same internal roads that carried materials between storage and workshops could channel prisoners in controlled sequence, illustrating that architecture and policy were intertwined, each reinforcing the other. And by the autumn of 1943, the camp's spatial order stood complete, a network of structures embedded within a larger administrative hierarchy, ready to serve whichever directive emerged from district leadership, whether continued exploitation or decisive elimination, and thus space itself became an active component of history at Poniatowa, shaping experience, enabling oversight, and determining how events unfolded within its confines. And when Operation Harvest Festival was authorized, the camp's physical arrangement allowed the synchronized implementation of policy without the need for structural modification, underscoring how the landscape had been gradually prepared through earlier phases for a final transformation that would bring its function to an abrupt end. And in this way, the construction and layout of Poniatowa were not neutral background elements but integral parts of a system in which wood, wire, and measured alignment served administrative intent, embedding authority into the rural horizon and ensuring that the ground itself participated in the execution of policy defined beyond its fences. Chapter 4, Segment 1. Camp Administration and Command Structure. By the time Poniatowa was fully established as a Jewish forced labor camp within the Lublin district, its daily operation depended upon a clearly defined administrative hierarchy that connected local authority inside the perimeter to regional command structures operating beyond it, and understanding this hierarchy is essential to understanding how the camp functioned not as an isolated installation but as one component in a broader system overseen by SS and police leadership, because decisions regarding prisoner allocation, labor deployment, security measures, and ultimately liquidation were shaped by directives that moved through layered channels of command, beginning at higher levels of authority and descending through district administration to camp-level officers responsible for implementation, and within the general government overall governance was formally under the authority of the Governor-General, Hans Frank, but in matters concerning Jewish policy and security, real power in the Lublin district rested largely with the SS and police leader, Odilo Globoknik, whose role in organizing Action Reinhard placed him at the center of deportation planning, extermination center construction, and the management of labor camps such as Poniatowa. And under this regional leadership, camp commandants were appointed to supervise daily operations, maintain order, and ensure that directives were carried out according to schedule, supported by SS personnel and auxiliary guards who enforced discipline, conducted roll calls, and oversaw labor detachments, and the camp commandant functioned as the immediate authority within the perimeter. Yet his authority was bounded by reporting requirements and oversight from district officials who monitored prisoner numbers, production output, and security assessments, creating a chain of accountability that linked the rural compound to administrative offices in Lublin. And within the camp, administrative clerks maintained records of prisoner registration, labor assignments, material inventories, and disciplinary actions, generating documentation that reinforced the bureaucratic character of the system, because every individual confined at Poniatowa was entered into lists that categorized them according to labor capacity and housing location, reducing personal identity to functional designation within a structured file system. And this documentation not only facilitated economic exploitation but also prepared the administrative groundwork for future policy shifts, as accurate records allowed authorities to calculate total populations and coordinate actions across multiple sites. And the presence of this hierarchical and documented structure underscores that Poniatowa's operation was methodical rather than improvised, embedded within an administrative culture that valued precision and coordination, and even routine procedures such as morning and evening roll calls served dual purposes of maintaining order and confirming numerical consistency between physical presence and written record, reflecting the central importance of accounting within the SS system, and this hierarchical framework extended beyond purely German personnel, as auxiliary guards recruited from occupied territories participated in enforcement, illustrating how occupation governance incorporated multiple layers of authority within a unified command structure. And by examining the administrative chain at Poniatowa, we see how power flowed from district leadership to camp commandant to guard units, with each level reinforcing the next through reporting and supervision, ensuring that the camp operated in alignment with broader regional objectives. And when those objectives shifted in late 1943 toward coordinated elimination under Operation Harvest Festival, the same hierarchical structure facilitated rapid implementation, as orders transmitted from above were executed within a disciplined framework accustomed to routine obedience, demonstrating that administration and command were not peripheral details but central mechanisms through which policy was enacted on the ground, shaping both the daily experience of prisoners and the ultimate course of the camp's history within the Lublin district. Chapter 4, Segment 2. SS personnel, guard units, and enforcement mechanisms. The functioning of Poniatowa as a forced labor camp depended not only on written directives and administrative paperwork, but on the presence of personnel who translated those directives into daily enforcement. And the composition of these personnel reflects the broader structure of SS authority in the Lublin district, where a relatively small number of German officers operated within a layered system supported by auxiliary guards recruited from occupied territories, creating a hierarchy in which responsibility flowed downward from regional command to camp commandant and from there to subordinate officers and watch units tasked with maintaining order inside the perimeter. And at the top of the camp's internal chain stood the commandant, appointed under SS authority and accountable to district leadership, responsible for overseeing registration procedures, labor allocation, disciplinary decisions, and communication with administrative offices in Lublin, while beneath him served SS non-commissioned officers and administrative clerks who managed documentation, supervised workshops, and ensured that roll calls were conducted accurately and consistently, reinforcing the bureaucratic dimension of control. And the guard force itself typically included members of the SS as well as auxiliary units, sometimes referred to as Trawniki men, who had been trained at the Trawniki camp and deployed to various sites across occupied Poland to support security operations. And these guards were assigned to perimeter towers, gate checkpoints, and internal patrol routes, forming a continuous presence that structured daily life through visibility and surveillance. And their duties included overseeing prisoner movement from housing barracks to workstations, monitoring assembly during roll calls, enforcing curfews after work hours, and responding to any perceived deviation from prescribed routine, illustrating how enforcement operated not through constant spectacle but through predictable and sustained oversight, and the architecture of the camp reinforced this personnel structure, as guard towers provided elevated observation points, fencing delineated clear boundaries, and internal pathways narrowed movement into channels that could be easily supervised, ensuring that relatively small numbers of armed personnel could manage large prisoner populations through spatial control rather than direct confrontation, and disciplinary authority was embedded within this structure, with punishments administered to reinforce compliance and deter resistance, though the emphasis in daily routine remained on maintaining labor productivity rather than engaging in arbitrary disruption. Because the camp's purpose during much of its operation centered on economic output tied to textile production, and thus enforcement mechanisms balanced coercion with regulated order, sustaining an environment in which prisoners were compelled to work under threat while administrative reports recorded measurable results, and the integration of auxiliary guards into this system demonstrates how occupation governance extended beyond a single national cadre, incorporating individuals trained specifically for camp duty and deployed according to regional needs, thereby standardizing enforcement practices across multiple sites in the Lublin district, including Majdanek and Trawniki, And by situating Poniatowa within this broader personnel network, we see that its daily functioning was supported by a disciplined hierarchy accustomed to implementing directives without deviation, a structure that would prove decisive when orders shifted in late 1943, because the same guard units and supervisory framework that regulated labor could be redirected toward coordinated elimination under Operation Harvest Festival, illustrating that enforcement mechanisms established for economic exploitation were structurally adaptable to final action, and thus the presence of SS officers and auxiliary guards at Poniatowa was not merely background to its history but central to understanding how authority was maintained, how routine was sustained, and how policy could be executed swiftly once transmitted through established chains of command embedded within the camp's spatial design. Chapter 4, Segment 3. Bureaucracy, Record-Keeping, and Administrative Precision. While guard towers and perimeter fencing made authority visible at Poniatowa, the deeper mechanism sustaining the camp's operation lay in its bureaucracy, because the SS system functioned not only through coercion but through documentation, calculation, and structured record-keeping that reduced individuals to entries in registries and labor categories within an organized administrative framework, and inside the camp clerks maintained detailed lists recording prisoner names, identification, numbers, arrival dates, labor assignments, housing locations, and, when applicable, transfers or deaths, ensuring that physical presence corresponded with written record, and this emphasis on numerical accuracy was central to the camp's integration within the Lublin district's wider network, as reports summarizing workforce totals and production output were transmitted upward to district authorities, linking Poniatowa's internal statistics to regional assessments of economic utility and security, and the bureaucratic environment extended into daily procedures, as roll calls conducted morning and evening were not merely ritualized assemblies, but accounting exercises in which discrepancies between recorded totals and physical counts required immediate explanation, reinforcing the perception that order was maintained through precision rather than improvisation, and administrative offices located within secured sections of the camp served as hubs where correspondence, requisition, forms, labor schedules, and supply inventories were organized, creating a steady flow of paperwork that paralleled the flow of materials in the workshops, and this documentation system also categorized prisoners according to perceived skill and productivity, assigning those with tailoring experience to textile production while designating others to maintenance, storage, or support roles, thereby embedding economic logic into the record itself, and the existence of such detailed files meant that the camp's population was continuously evaluated in quantitative terms, facilitating decisions about expansion, transfer, or eventually elimination, because accurate figures allowed regional authorities to coordinate actions across multiple camps simultaneously, and this administrative precision was characteristic of the broader SS structure, where extermination policy was intertwined with economic calculation and logistical planning, demonstrating that violence and bureaucracy were not separate elements but mutually reinforcing components of the system, and at Poniatowa the orderly arrangement of barracks and workshops mirrored the orderly arrangement of documents within filing systems, each reflecting a commitment to structure that extended from physical layout to paper record, and when Operation Harvest Festival was planned in late 1943, the same registries that had tracked labor capacity provided the numerical foundation for coordinated action, enabling authorities to estimate total prisoner counts and synchronize operations with Majdanek and Trawniki, illustrating that bureaucracy did not merely accompany policy but enabled its execution with scale and coordination. And by examining the record-keeping practices at Poniatowa, we see how the camp's history was inscribed not only on land but on paper, how administrative precision sustained months of exploitation, and how those same files would later serve as evidence in post-war investigations, preserving documentation that outlasted the physical structures of the camp itself, ensuring that the bureaucratic imprint of Poniatowa's operation remained part of the historical record long after its barracks and fences had receded into the rural landscape. Chapter 4, Segment 4. Discipline, Regulation, and the Structure of Daily Control. Within Poniatowa, Authority was not exercised only through visible guards or written records, but through a regulated system of daily control that shaped behavior, movement, and routine in measured and repetitive ways, reinforcing hierarchy without constant overt force, because the camp's administration relied upon predictability to maintain order among thousands confined within limited space, and this predictability was achieved through strict scheduling, clearly defined rules, and consistent enforcement practices that structured every hour from early morning roll call to evening confinement. And at dawn, prisoners were assembled in the central roll call square where numbers were checked against registry lists, establishing numerical certainty before labor detachments were directed toward assigned workshops or maintenance duties. And this daily accounting served as both administrative confirmation and symbolic reinforcement of authority, as the act of standing information under supervision underscored the relationship between recorded identity and physical presence. And after roll call, work details moved along designated internal pathways to textile production barracks, where supervision continued under both SS personnel and designated overseers responsible for maintaining output targets, ensuring that sewing machines operated steadily and that material flow remained organized. And the workday followed extended hours, broken by limited pauses that were regulated rather than discretionary, reinforcing the notion that time itself was administered within the camp, and beyond production zones disciplinary measures existed to address perceived violations of camp rules, ranging from restrictions and reprimands to harsher penalties imposed under the authority of camp officers, illustrating that compliance was maintained through an established framework rather than sporadic reaction. And internal regulations extended into housing arrangements as well, where barack assignments were recorded, curfews enforced, and evening roll calls conducted to confirm numerical consistency, ensuring that each day concluded with administrative certainty similar to its beginning, and the presence of auxiliary guards along patrol routes and at perimeter towers created a layered system of observation that extended discipline beyond formal assemblies into the spaces between buildings, minimizing opportunities for unmonitored interaction. And yet, despite this structured control, the outward appearance of routine contributed to an atmosphere that could seem stable to those within the system, particularly as textile production continued month after month, reinforcing the impression that the camp's purpose lay in sustained labor rather than abrupt transformation. And this stability was not accidental but cultivated through regulation, because order facilitated productivity and documentation, aligning daily control with economic objectives, while at the same time preserving readiness for policy shifts directed from above. And by late 1943 this readiness became critical, as the same disciplined framework that organized labor could be redirected toward coordinated action without structural disruption, demonstrating how the apparatus of regulation was adaptable to changing priorities. And thus the structure of daily control at Poniatowa, roll calls, labor shifts, curfews, patrol routes, was more than routine management. It was the operational core through which authority was normalized, hierarchy maintained, and policy prepared for implementation, embedding discipline into the rhythm of the camp's existence and shaping the lived experience of confinement in ways that would later influence how events unfolded during the final phase of its history within the Lublin district. Chapter 4, Segment 5. Authority consolidated before the final directive. By the autumn of 1943, the administrative and enforcement structures at Poniatowa had reached a level of consolidation that reflected months of regulated operation under SS authority. And this consolidation was visible not only in the predictable rhythm of daily routine, but in the clarity of hierarchical roles that defined responsibility at every level, from district command to camp officers to auxiliary guards, creating an environment in which directives could move swiftly through established channels without procedural delay. And the camp commandant, supported by SS personnel and clerical staff, maintained oversight of prisoner registration, labor allocation, and discipline, ensuring that documentation remained accurate and that economic output aligned with expectations transmitted from Lublin, while guard units enforced perimeter security and internal order with consistency, reinforcing the sense that authority was continuous rather than episodic. And this stability of structure contributed to an outward appearance of permanence, particularly as textile production continued into late 1943 and reports reflected sustained labor capacity among thousands of prisoners. Yet beneath this appearance of continuity, the broader political context was shifting, and district-level leadership faced mounting pressure as German forces encountered sustained Soviet advances on the Eastern Front, prompting reassessment of how best to manage remaining Jewish labor populations concentrated. In camps such as Poniatowa, Trawniki, and Majdanek, and the existence of a disciplined administrative framework at Poniatowa meant that any new directive could be implemented with precision. Because accurate prisoner counts were maintained, assembly areas were clearly defined, and security personnel were accustomed to coordinating large-scale movement within the perimeter, and thus the consolidation of authority that had supported months of exploitation simultaneously prepared the conditions for abrupt transformation, illustrating how bureaucratic stability and operational readiness were intertwined. And in the days preceding November 1943, subtle indications of increased coordination within the Lublin district suggested that a broader plan was nearing implementation, as additional security units were observed and communication between camps intensified, though daily routine within Poniatowa remained outwardly unchanged, reinforcing among prisoners the fragile perception that labor function continued as before, and this coexistence of structured order and concealed planning underscores how the SS system relied upon disciplined hierarchy to execute policy without visible disruption until the moment of action. And when Operation Harvest Festival was authorized, the administrative consolidation already in place at Poniatowa ensured that instructions could be enacted without improvisation, as assembly squares, guard positions, and internal pathways were all configured to channel movement according to directive, demonstrating that authority had been prepared long before the final order was issued. And by examining this moment of consolidation, we see how the camp's command structure, enforcement mechanisms, and bureaucratic precision formed a unified apparatus capable of sustaining labor and, when commanded, of concluding it, embedding within the quiet rural landscape a disciplined framework whose final purpose would soon be revealed, linking months of regulated routine to a single coordinated action that would bring Poniatowa's operation to an end within the wider context of the Lublin district's final phase of Action Reinhard. Chapter 5, Segment 1. Prisoner Categories and Population Structure. By the time Poniatowa reached its peak as a Jewish forced labor camp in 1943, its internal population reflected a layered structure shaped by earlier deportations, selections, and transfers within the Lublin district and beyond, and understanding this population structure is essential to understanding how the camp functioned both as an economic installation and as a holding site within the broader framework of Action Reinhard, because the individuals confined within its perimeter did not arrive randomly but were the result of administrative processes that categorized people according to perceived labor capacity, prior location, and regional policy decisions, and a substantial portion of Poniatowa's prisoner population consisted of Jews transferred from the Warsaw Ghetto following mass deportations in 1942 and the suppression of the uprising in April and May 1943, as SS authorities selected individuals considered fit for work and reassigned them to labor camps rather than immediate extermination centers, integrating them into textile production facilities where their skills could be utilized, while others arrived from smaller ghettos liquidated across the general government, each transfer representing a further contraction of Jewish communal life into confined labor installations under SS control, and within the camp administrative clerks registered new arrivals, assigning identification numbers and housing locations, recording names and origin points when available, and dividing prisoners into categories primarily determined by work function, with skilled tailors, seamstresses, and craftsmen directed to textile workshops, others assigned to storage management, maintenance, or support roles within the compound, and some designated for labor details related to infrastructure upkeep, illustrating how functional classification replaced personal identity within the bureaucratic system, and the population also included men and women of varying ages, who had survived earlier phases of persecution, many having already endured ghettoization, hunger, and displacement before arriving at Poniatowa, and although the camp did not formally divide prisoners by family units, internal housing arrangements often reflected labor grouping rather than familial ties, reinforcing the primacy of economic logic over social continuity. And at its height, the camp held many thousands of prisoners, estimates often ranging between 14 and 16,000 by late 1943, making it one of the largest Jewish labor camps in the Lublin district. And this concentration of population within a single enclosed space carried implications beyond production, because it represented one of the last substantial Jewish communities remaining under direct SS control in the region after the liquidation of ghettos and the winding down of extermination centers such as Belzec and Treblinka, and the presence of such a large labor population placed Poniatowa within a delicate balance between exploitation and elimination, as continued productivity justified its operation while shifting military realities and security concerns increasingly influenced regional policy decisions, and daily life within the camp reflected this population structure. As roll calls assembled thousands in formation, workshops operated at scale with rows of machines tended by assigned laborers, and barracks housed densely packed groups whose composition mirrored administrative categorization. Yet beneath the routine lay awareness among many prisoners of the uncertain status of labor camps in late 1943. Given the known fate of other Jewish populations across occupied Poland, and thus the internal demographic structure of Poniatowa was not merely a statistic but a reflection of broader historical processes that had compressed diverse communities into a single controlled space, embedding within the camp the final survivors of destroyed ghettos whose presence both sustained textile production and marked the narrowing horizon of Jewish life in the Lublin district, setting the stage for decisions that would soon transform the meaning of those numbers recorded in administrative files into a coordinated action that would end the camp's existence within a matter of hours during Operation Harvest Festival. Chapter 5, Segment 2. Daily Life, Routine, and Survival Within Structure. Inside Poniatowa, beyond the administrative classifications and population statistics, daily life unfolded within a structured rhythm that balanced coercion with routine, creating a predictable framework through which thousands of prisoners moved from dawn to evening under supervision. And this rhythm was central to the camp's function as a labor installation, because consistency in movement, timing, and task assignment ensured both productivity and control. And each day typically began before sunrise with the sounding of assembly, as prisoners emerged from overcrowded wooden barracks and gathered in the central roll call square, standing in rows while guards and administrative clerks verified numbers against registry lists, a procedure that reinforced the bureaucratic logic of the camp by linking written documentation to physical presence. And after roll call, labor detachments were organized according to assignment, with textile workers directed toward workshop barracks where sewing machines were arranged in rows, cutting tables prepared for fabric processing, and storage areas stocked with materials destined to become uniforms and military garments, while others were assigned to maintenance, cleaning, transport of goods, or kitchen duties necessary to sustain the internal operation of the camp, and the workday extended for long hours under supervision, with limited breaks regulated by overseers who monitored output and ensured adherence to production quotas transmitted from district authorities, reinforcing the perception that economic value defined survival within the camp hierarchy, and rations distributed during the day were minimal, calculated to sustain labor capacity rather than health. And evening brought a return to barracks following another roll call assembly where numbers were again checked to confirm alignment between recorded totals and actual presence, embedding numerical precision into the structure of each day. And within housing barracks, prisoners occupied stacked wooden bunks arranged tightly to maximize space, with limited ventilation and insulation that exposed occupants to seasonal extremes of cold and heat. Yet even within these confined conditions, informal networks of support formed, as individuals shared food portions, exchanged information quietly, and attempted to maintain fragments of personal identity amid imposed categorization, illustrating how communal resilience persisted within structured confinement. And religious observance or cultural practice was constrained but not entirely absent, often carried out discreetly to avoid punishment, reinforcing the human dimension within a system designed for regulation rather than community, and the visibility of guard towers and fencing remained constant, a reminder of enclosure that shaped perception of space and limited the horizon of possibility. Yet beyond the perimeter, fields and forests continued in seasonal rhythm, underscoring the contrast between confinement and continuity, and this duality defined daily experience at Poniatowa, where routine created an appearance of stability even as broader political and military developments threatened that stability from outside. And by late 1943, rumors circulated quietly among prisoners about changing conditions in other camps and shifting German fortunes on the Eastern Front, though precise information was scarce, leaving uncertainty as a persistent undercurrent beneath structured labor. And thus, daily life at Poniatowa was neither chaotic nor static but regulated and provisional, sustained by administrative order and enforced routine, yet vulnerable to directives that could alter its course without warning, demonstrating how survival within the camp was shaped by adherence to schedule, compliance with assigned tasks, and the fragile hope that continued usefulness might delay more decisive outcomes within the evolving context of the Lublin district. Chapter 5, Segment 3: Labor System, Production Quotas, and Economic Integration. At the core of Poniatowa's operation as a Jewish forced labor camp was its integration into a structured labor system designed to support German military supply through textile production. And this economic dimension shaped not only the daily schedule of prisoners but the administrative priorities of camp leadership, because output targets, material inventories, and workforce allocation were closely monitored and reported within the broader framework of SS economic management in the Lublin district, and workshops inside adapted barracks were organized to maximize efficiency, with sewing machines arranged in ordered rows, cutting tables positioned to facilitate systematic fabric processing, and designated storage areas for both raw materials and finished uniforms, creating a production environment that mirrored industrial facilities beyond the camp's perimeter, though maintained under coercive supervision rather than voluntary employment, and prisoners selected for textile work often possessed prior experience as tailors or seamstresses from urban ghettos such as Warsaw, where craft traditions had long been established, and upon arrival at Poniatowa their skills were reassigned to serve German military needs, reflecting how the SS system evaluated individuals primarily according to perceived economic usefulness, and labor detachments were structured in shifts extending through most of the day, with overseers ensuring adherence to quotas transmitted from district authorities, reinforcing the principle that productivity justified the camp's continued operation within the economic apparatus of occupation, and materials used in workshops were supplied through administrative channels linking Poniatowa to regional depots, while finished garments were transported outward to distribution points serving units engaged on various fronts, embedding the rural camp within supply networks that extended far beyond eastern Poland. And this integration fostered among some prisoners a guarded belief that sustained output might provide temporary security, as long as their labor remained valuable within the hierarchy. Yet this perception was fragile because economic function existed within a political context shaped by ideological commitment to extermination and shifting military realities. And by mid to late 1943, the broader structure of Aktion Reinhard had already eliminated the majority of Jewish communities in the Lublin district, leaving labor camps like Poniatowa as some of the last concentrated Jewish populations under SS control, creating a tension between continued exploitation and strategic reassessment as German forces faced mounting pressure on the Eastern Front, and administrative correspondence in the district began to reflect heightened attention to security coordination across camps, indicating that economic calculation alone no longer determined policy, and thus while production continued and daily quotas were recorded with bureaucratic precision, the camp's integration into the labor system did not guarantee permanence, because the same reporting structures that tracked output also provided the numerical foundation for coordinated action when directives shifted, demonstrating how economic integration and administrative control were interdependent elements within a system capable of rapid transformation. And by examining the labor system at Poniatowa, we see how exploitation operated within a structured framework of documentation and oversight, shaping daily routine and sustaining the illusion of stability, yet always contingent upon decisions made beyond the workshops and barracks, decisions that would soon redefine the purpose of the camp within the closing phase of Aktion Reinhard in the Lublin district. Chapter 5, Segment 4. Living Conditions, Health, and the Limits of Endurance. While Poniatowa's workshops and production quotas defined its economic role within the Lublin district, the living conditions inside the camp shaped the physical and psychological endurance of those confined there, and these conditions were inseparable from the camp's structural design and administrative priorities, because housing arrangements, food distribution, sanitation systems, and medical access were all organized to sustain labor capacity rather than individual well-being, reinforcing the principle that prisoners were evaluated primarily through productivity, and the wooden barracks that housed thousands were constructed for function rather than comfort, often overcrowded with stacked bunks arranged in tight rows to maximize occupancy, leaving limited personal space and minimal privacy, while insulation against seasonal extremes was inadequate, exposing prisoners to harsh winters marked by cold drafts through thin walls, and to humid summers when ventilation proved insufficient and sanitation facilities were positioned within designated sections of the compound but strained under the weight of population density, creating conditions in which hygiene depended not only on infrastructure but on the resilience and cooperation of those confined, and food rations distributed through camp kitchens were calculated to maintain minimal strength necessary for sustained labor, consisting of limited portions that rarely met nutritional needs, resulting in gradual physical depletion over time, particularly among those assigned to demanding work details, and medical care within the camp was constrained by resources and administrative priorities, with treatment often focused on preserving labor capacity rather than comprehensive recovery, and illnesses spread more easily within crowded barracks, reinforcing vulnerability among prisoners whose immunity had already been weakened by prior experiences of ghettoization, deportation, and deprivation. Yet despite these limitations, informal networks of mutual support emerged, as prisoners shared food when possible, exchanged information quietly, and attempted to assist those who fell ill within the constraints imposed by supervision, illustrating the persistence of human solidarity within a system designed to regulate and reduce individuality, and religious observance or personal rituals, though restricted, sometimes continued discreetly, providing moments of psychological continuity amid enforced routine, and the visibility of guard towers and fencing remained constant reminders of confinement, shaping perception of space and reinforcing the limits within which daily endurance unfolded, while beyond the perimeter the rural landscape continued its seasonal rhythm, fields cultivated and villages inhabited in contrast to the enclosed environment inside, underscoring the separation between ordinary life and regulated existence. And as 1943 progressed and the camp's population reached its peak, the strain on housing and resources intensified, magnifying the effects of overcrowding and limited rations. Yet the administrative focus remained centered on maintaining output, ensuring that production lines continued despite declining physical strength among workers, and this imbalance between economic demand and human capacity illustrates how living conditions at Poniatowa were structured to serve policy objectives rather than humanitarian considerations, embedding deprivation within the camp's operational design. And by examining these conditions, we gain insight into the daily reality that underlay statistical records and production reports, recognizing that behind every entry in administrative files stood individuals navigating hunger, fatigue, and uncertainty within a confined landscape whose purpose was determined by authorities beyond its fences. And as late 1943 approached, the fragility of endurance inside the camp mirrored the fragility of its continued existence within a shifting political and military context, setting the stage for the decisive action that would soon redefine both the living conditions and the fate of all those recorded within its registries. Chapter 5, Segment 5. Community, Uncertainty, and the Fragile Illusion of Continuity. By the autumn of 1943, Poniatowa had become more than a structured labor installation. Within its fenced perimeter existed one of the last concentrated Jewish communities remaining in the Lublin district, composed of individuals who had survived earlier phases of deportation, ghetto liquidation, and displacement, and although the camp's administrative purpose centered on textile production and labor output, the presence of thousands living in proximity created a social environment shaped by shared experience, memory, and uncertainty, and within overcrowded barracks prisoners formed informal networks that provided emotional support and practical assistance, sharing limited rations, exchanging information about relatives or former neighborhoods, and attempting to preserve fragments of cultural and religious identity despite strict supervision, illustrating that even within regulated confinement, elements of communal life persisted in subdued form, and the daily routine of roll calls, work shifts, and curfews imposed structure upon this environment, reinforcing a rhythm that could appear stable from one day to the next. Yet beneath that stability lay awareness among many prisoners that labor camps across occupied Poland were provisional, subject to sudden closure or transfer based on decisions beyond their control, and news from outside filtered in slowly, often through newly arrived prisoners or whispered reports about changing conditions in other camps, including Majdanek and Trawniki, creating an atmosphere in which hope and apprehension coexisted, because continued productivity in the textile workshops fostered the belief that usefulness might prolong survival, particularly given widespread knowledge that those not selected for labor had often been deported directly to extermination centers, and this belief, though fragile, contributed to a collective effort to maintain output and avoid disciplinary infractions, reinforcing the illusion that adherence to routine might preserve continuity. Yet the broader context in late 1943 undermined that illusion, as German military setbacks on the Eastern Front increased pressure on occupation authorities and heightened concern about the risks associated with maintaining large Jewish labor populations concentrated within a limited geographic area, and administrative coordination within the Lublin district intensified, linking camps in discussions that emphasized security and synchronization rather than long-term production, though such developments were not openly communicated to prisoners inside Poniatowa, and thus daily life continued in structured repetition, with sewing machines operating, storage areas filled with uniforms awaiting transport, and barracks occupied each evening by those who had endured another day of regulated labor, while beyond the fences rural life moved in seasonal cycles, fields harvested and roads traversed without visible disruption, underscoring the separation between enclosed uncertainty and outward normalcy, and this coexistence of communal resilience and concealed planning defines the final phase of Poniatowa's existence as a labor camp, where thousands navigated deprivation and routine within a confined landscape that had already absorbed earlier transformations and now stood on the threshold of another, one that would dissolve both the illusion of continuity and the community that had formed within its perimeter, demonstrating how fragile stability can be when sustained by policy that is itself subject to abrupt redefinition. And as October 1943 drew to a close, the numbers recorded in administrative files represented not only workforce totals but the remaining presence of a community compressed into a single space, awaiting a directive that would soon alter the meaning of those figures entirely within the final phase of Aktion Reinhard in the Lublin district. Chapter 6, Segment 1. Operation Harvest Festival in Regional Context. By early November 1943, the fate of Poniatowa was no longer determined solely by its internal productivity or daily routine, but by a coordinated directive issued at the district level that would bring the final phase of Aktion Reinhard to a decisive conclusion, and this directive, known as Aktion Erntefest or Operation Harvest Festival, represented the largest single mass shooting action against Jews during the Holocaust, carried out over 2 consecutive days across multiple camps in the Lublin district, and to understand its significance for Poniatowa, it is necessary to situate the camp within the broader regional context that had evolved throughout 1942 and 1943, because by late 1943 the extermination centers of Belzec and Treblinka had largely ceased primary operations after completing their role in deportation-based killing, while Sobibor had experienced a prisoner uprising in October 1943 that resulted in temporary disruption and eventual closure, and Majdanek continued, functioning as both concentration camp and killing site, leaving forced labor camps such as Poniatowa and Trawniki as some of the last remaining large Jewish populations under direct SS control in the district, and at the same time German military setbacks on the Eastern Front, particularly following the defeat at Stalingrad and subsequent Soviet advances, intensified concerns among SS leadership regarding the security of occupied territories, creating apprehension that concentrated Jewish labor camps could become centers of unrest or be liberated by advancing forces, and these security anxieties intersected with ideological objectives, reinforcing the determination within district command to eliminate the remaining Jewish populations in a synchronized action that would prevent resistance and conclude the regional extermination program. And thus Operation Harvest Festival was conceived not as an isolated event but as a coordinated plan targeting Majdanek on November 3, 1943, followed by Trawniki and Poniatowa on November 4, with preparations including the digging of trenches at designated execution sites and the positioning of additional security units to ensure containment and rapid implementation, and administrative precision characterized the planning, as accurate prisoner counts maintained through months of bureaucratic record-keeping enabled authorities to calculate the scale of the operation and coordinate actions across camps without visible disruption beforehand, and for Poniatowa this meant that the same structured layout, assembly square, fenced perimeter, controlled gates, and regulated pathways, would facilitate the rapid gathering and confinement of thousands when the order was given, illustrating how architecture and administration converged in service of final policy, and the combined death toll across Majdanek, Trawniki, and Poniatowa during these 2 days is generally estimated at approximately 42,000, with Poniatowa accounting for roughly 14 to 15,000 victims, marking the definitive end of Jewish forced labor camps in the Lublin district, and this action closed the operational chapter of Aktion Reinhard in eastern Poland, transforming sites that had functioned as labor installations into grounds of mass execution within a synchronized time frame. And by situating Poniatowa within this regional context, we see that its destruction was not sudden improvisation but the culmination of a structured process shaped by military developments, ideological commitment, and bureaucratic coordination, linking the quiet rural fields of eastern Poland to one of the largest coordinated killing operations of the war, and setting the stage for the events of November 4, 1943, when the final directive would be carried out within the spatial and administrative framework that had defined the camp for months. Chapter 6, Segment 2. The Preparations and the Morning of November 4, 1943. In the days immediately preceding November 4, 1943, outward routine within Poniatowa continued with little visible disruption. Yet preparations for Operation Harvest Festival were already underway within the broader Lublin district, coordinated at levels of authority beyond the camp's internal administration, and while textile workshops remained active and roll calls were conducted according to established schedule, additional security personnel were discreetly positioned in the region, and trenches were prepared in advance at designated areas near the camp perimeter, reflecting a degree of planning that underscored the operation's synchronized character, because actions at Majdanek had begun on November 3rd, where thousands were assembled and shot over the course of the day, and the sequence required that Trawniki and Poniatowa follow on November 4th in order to prevent warning or resistance from spreading between camps, and within Poniatowa itself the physical layout central. Assembly square, fenced boundaries, controlled gates, and internal pathways enabled authorities to gather the entire prisoner population efficiently once the directive was issued, demonstrating how months of regulated routine facilitated rapid mobilization. And on the morning of November 4th, prisoners were ordered to assemble, as they had done countless times before. Yet this time the assembly did not lead to workshops but to containment under heightened guard presence. And the structured discipline that had governed daily life now operated in service of final action, with SS personnel and auxiliary guards coordinating movement toward prepared sites outside or at the edge of the camp compound, and the scale of the population, estimated at 14 to 15,000, required systematic sequencing, illustrating the administrative precision underlying the operation, and throughout the day the process unfolded under armed supervision, with measures taken to prevent escape and to maintain order within the confined space. And while music was reportedly played at high volume at some camps during Operation Harvest Festival to mask the sound of gunfire, reflecting an attempt to contain both noise and panic, the overall procedure at Poniatowa mirrored the coordinated approach implemented at other sites in the district, emphasizing speed, containment, and completion within a single day. And by evening the camp that had functioned as a major textile labor installation stood emptied of its prisoner population, its barracks and workshops intact but devoid of the thousands who had filled them only hours earlier, marking the abrupt end of its operational life. And the events of that day were not chaotic improvisation but the execution of a planned directive transmitted through established chains of command, illustrating how bureaucratic structure, spatial organization, and security coordination converged in a final act that concluded the presence of Jewish forced labor in the Lublin district, and in the silence that followed the camp's purpose had fundamentally changed, as the same fences and pathways that once directed labor now enclosed absence, linking Poniatowa irrevocably to Operation Harvest Festival and to the broader historical narrative of coordinated mass shootings that characterized the final phase of Action Reinhard in eastern Poland. Chapter 6, Segment 3. Aftermath within the camp perimeter. By the evening of November 4, 1943, the structured world that had defined Poniatowa for more than a year as a Jewish forced labor camp had been fundamentally altered, and the transformation was marked not by visible destruction of buildings, but by the absence of the thousands who had filled its barracks only hours before, because Operation Harvest Festival had concluded the existence of one of the largest Jewish labor populations remaining in the Lublin district, leaving behind an empty compound, whose physical structures, wooden housing blocks, textile workshops, administrative offices, guard towers, and perimeter fencing, stood largely intact, yet stripped of the human presence that had animated daily routine, and in the immediate aftermath additional units were tasked with securing the site, overseeing the burial areas prepared in advance, and ensuring that the coordinated action across Majdanek, Trawniki, and Poniatowa had been completed without interruption, reflecting the administrative thoroughness that characterized the operation, and the death toll at Poniatowa is generally estimated between 14 and 15,000, making it one of the single largest mass shooting sites of the Holocaust. And when combined with the killings at Majdanek and Trawniki over 2 days, the total reached approximately 42,000 victims, representing the final large-scale execution phase of Action Reinhard in occupied Poland. And after the operation, the camp's infrastructure did not immediately disappear. Rather, authorities assessed how the site might be repurposed, as had occurred earlier in its history when it shifted from a Soviet prisoner of war camp to a Jewish labor installation, demonstrating the adaptability of its physical layout to changing directives, and surviving documentation indicates that some structures were later used for other detention or storage purposes, while evidence of the mass shooting was partially concealed through efforts to cover burial trenches and limit visible traces, though the scale of the action could not be entirely erased from the landscape, and beyond the perimeter the rural environment continued its seasonal cycle, fields cultivated and villages inhabited, creating a stark contrast between continuity outside and the abrupt conclusion within, and this contrast underscores how swiftly policy could redefine the meaning of space under occupation governance, as the same assembly square that had hosted roll calls for labor now marked the final gathering of a community that had endured displacement, deprivation, and uncertain hope. And in the weeks that followed Operation Harvest Festival, the Lublin district no longer contained large Jewish labor camps, signaling the effective completion of Action Reinhardt's regional objective, and Poniatowa's transformation from agricultural land to POW camp, then to textile labor site, and finally to mass execution ground encapsulates the layered Progression of occupation policy over 2 years, illustrating how administrative structure, spatial organization, and ideological commitment converged to shape each phase. And in the quiet that followed November 1943, the wooden barracks and fenced boundaries stood as material remnants of a system that had relied upon documentation, discipline, and coordination, yet whose ultimate purpose had resolved into elimination, embedding the memory of those 14,000 to 15,000 victims within the soil of Eastern Poland, and setting the stage for the post-war reckoning that would seek to document, investigate, and memorialize what had occurred within the perimeter of a camp that once operated under the appearance of routine before concluding in a single, synchronized action directed from beyond its rural horizon. Chapter 6, Segment 4. Erasure, Reuse, and the Silence that Followed. In the days and weeks after November 4, 1943, Poniatowa did not vanish from the landscape, yet its meaning shifted completely, because while the barracks, fencing, and guard towers remained standing, the camp's primary population had been eliminated in a single coordinated action, and the administrative focus turned towards securing the site, managing the burial areas, and determining how its infrastructure might be reused within the evolving needs of the German occupation system, illustrating once again how physical structures were treated as adaptable assets rather than fixed memorials. And reports indicate that efforts were made to conceal the evidence of mass shootings, including covering execution trenches and limiting access to burial grounds, reflecting a broader pattern across Operation Harvest Festival sites in which authorities attempted to reduce visible traces of the killings, even as the scale of the action rendered full concealment impossible. And within the perimeter, the workshops that had once echoed with the mechanical rhythm of sewing machines fell silent. The assembly square no longer filled with thousands during roll calls, and the barracks stood largely empty, marking an abrupt end to the structured daily life that had characterized the camp's existence as a labor installation. Yet the site's geographic position in the Lublin district meant it retained logistical value, and like other camps whose functions had changed over time, Poniatowa's infrastructure could be reassigned according to emerging needs, demonstrating the utilitarian logic that governed occupation policy, in which land and buildings were continually repurposed as directives shifted, and beyond the camp's boundaries the surrounding rural landscape continued in seasonal rhythm, fields harvested and village roads traversed without visible interruption, underscoring the contrast between the sudden absence inside the perimeter and the continuity outside it. And this contrast amplified the sense of silence that followed the operation, as a space once densely populated became largely empty within hours, and the administrative records that had meticulously tracked prisoner numbers and labor output now documented completion of the operation, closing the final chapter of Aktion Reinhard in the Lublin district, and for the SS leadership Operation Harvest Festival resolved both ideological and security concerns by eliminating the remaining Jewish labor populations in the region, aligning extermination policy with wartime calculations shaped by advancing Soviet forces and fear of resistance, and thus Poniatowa's final transformation was embedded within broader strategic developments of late 1943, reflecting how military context intersected with racial policy and bureaucratic capacity, and the quiet that settled over the camp after November 4th did not signify resolution but rather the removal of those whose presence had defined it, leaving behind structures that bore witness to layered histories of detention, exploitation, and mass killing. And in this way, the silence that followed was not empty but heavy with implication, as the ground itself retained the memory of thousands whose lives had been compressed into administrative categories and then erased within a synchronized action, linking the rural horizon of Eastern Poland to one of the largest coordinated mass shootings of the Holocaust, and marking Poniatowa's transition from functioning camp to site of absence, awaiting the post-war period when investigators, survivors, and historians would seek to reconstruct what had occurred within its fences and ensure that the silence did not become permanent obscurity in the historical record. Chapter 6, Segment 5. The End of Labor and the Closing of Aktion Reinhard. With the completion of Operation Harvest Festival on the 3rd and the 4th of November 1943, The system of Jewish forced labor camps in the Lublin district effectively ceased to exist in its prior form, and Poniatowa's destruction marked not only the end of a single camp but the final consolidation of Aktion Reinhard within this region of occupied Poland, because by eliminating the remaining large Jewish labor populations at Majdanek, Trawniki, and Poniatowa, SS authorities concluded the regional phase of extermination that had begun with deportations to Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka in 1942, and the significance of this moment extends beyond the immediate tragedy of the 14,000 to 15,000 victims at Poniatowa, as it represents the culmination of a structured policy that moved sequentially from ghettoization to deportation, from centralized killing centers to labor exploitation, and finally to coordinated mass shooting of the last survivors retained for economic use, illustrating how ideological commitment and administrative planning converged over time toward comprehensive elimination. And after November 1943, the Lublin district no longer contained major Jewish labor camps under SS control, signaling that the objectives of Aktion Reinhard in this region had been completed according to the terms defined by its architects, even as the broader war continued and other concentration camps across Europe remained operational, and the closure of Poniatowa's labor function thus reflected a strategic shift shaped by military developments on the Eastern Front, where advancing Soviet forces increased urgency within German command structures to secure territory, prevent potential uprisings, and remove populations considered both ideological targets and security liabilities. And this shift underscores that Operation Harvest Festival was not an isolated eruption of violence, but the final administrative act in a sequence shaped by war, policy, and bureaucratic coordination. And within the perimeter of Poniatowa, the barracks and workshops that had once embodied economic integration now stood as remnants of a system that had resolved its internal tension between exploitation and extermination by eliminating the labor force entirely. And the administrative records that had once tracked quotas and assignments now marked completion of the operation, transforming numerical data into final tallies. And beyond the camp, the rural landscape continued its outward continuity. Yet the demographic reality of the region had been permanently altered, as Jewish communities that had existed for generations in towns and villages across eastern Poland were no longer present, their survivors having been concentrated, exploited, and ultimately killed within sites like Poniatowa. And thus Chapter 6 concludes not only the narrative of a single day in November 1943, but the broader trajectory of the camp's existence, tracing how a parcel of agricultural land became a prisoner of war facility, then a textile labor installation, and finally part of the largest coordinated mass shooting action of the Holocaust, embedding within its soil the memory of thousands whose lives were reduced to entries in registries before being erased in a synchronized directive. And the end of labor at Poniatowa stands as the final chapter of Aktion Reinhard in the Lublin district, a closing shaped by structured authority, disciplined hierarchy, and calculated timing, linking the quiet fields of eastern Poland to the broader history of extermination policy implemented with bureaucratic precision during the Second World War. Chapter 7, Segment 1. Immediate Aftermath and Regional Reorganization. In the weeks following Operation Harvest Festival, the Lublin district entered a new administrative phase in which the elimination of Jewish labor camps required reorganization of facilities, personnel, and documentation, and Poniatowa, now emptied of its prisoner population, stood as a site whose structures remained usable even though its prior function had concluded, illustrating how occupation authorities treated space as adaptable infrastructure rather than fixed memorial ground. And within the broader regional system, SS leadership assessed how to redistribute guard units, reassign administrative staff, and determine the logistical value of former labor installations, because the war continued and resources were increasingly strained as Soviet forces advanced westward, creating pressure on German command to consolidate assets and prepare defensive positions, and thus Poniatowa's barracks and workshops, though no longer housing Jewish laborers, represented built capacity that could be incorporated into other military or detention purposes, reflecting the utilitarian logic that had governed the camp's earlier transformations from prisoner of war facility to textile production center, and administrative files compiled before and during Operation Harvest Festival were reviewed and archived, contributing to district-level reports that documented the completion of the coordinated action across Majdanek, Trawniki, and Poniatowa, reinforcing the bureaucratic narrative that framed the killings as the final execution of policy rather than as disruption of order. And in this sense, the immediate aftermath was characterized by continuity of administration rather than collapse. As clerks maintained paperwork, officers issued new instructions, and guard personnel followed reassignment orders, embedding the event within routine governance. And yet, beneath this administrative continuity lay a demographic absence that permanently altered the social composition of the region, because Jewish communities that had once filled ghettos and later labor camps were no longer present, their removal reshaping the human landscape of eastern Poland, and the rural environment surrounding Poniatowa continued its seasonal cycle, fields cultivated and roads traversed as before, creating a visual continuity that contrasted sharply with the transformation inside the camp perimeter, where silence replaced the structured noise of workshops and roll calls. And this juxtaposition between outward normalcy and internal absence underscores how the occupation system sought to absorb even large-scale killing operations into administrative flow, minimizing visible disruption while altering reality in fundamental ways. And for the remaining German authorities in the district, the elimination of Jewish labor camps resolved immediate security concerns, particularly fears of resistance or uprising, and simplified management of occupied territory in a period of military uncertainty. Yet it also marked the end of an economic labor system that had contributed to military supply, illustrating how policy decisions were shaped by shifting priorities between exploitation and perceived strategic necessity. And as winter approached in late 1943, Poniatowa's structures stood largely unused or repurposed, their wooden walls and fenced boundaries bearing witness to layered histories of detention, labor, and coordinated execution, and thus the immediate aftermath of Operation Harvest Festival at Poniatowa was defined not by destruction of buildings, but by administrative reorganization and demographic erasure, embedding the camp within a new phase of occupation governance shaped by retreating fronts and consolidating control, setting the stage for eventual liberation of the region in 1944, and the beginning of a post-war process that would seek to uncover and document what had occurred within its perimeter. Chapter 7, Segment 2. Approaching Front Lines and the Collapse of German Control. As the months progressed after Operation Harvest Festival, the wider military situation increasingly shaped the future of the Lublin district, including the site of Poniatowa, because by early 1944 the Eastern Front was no longer distant but steadily moving westward, driven by sustained Soviet offensives that followed the turning point battles of 1943, and German forces in occupied Poland began preparing defensive strategies while simultaneously dismantling or abandoning installations that could not be maintained under advancing pressure. And within this changing context, Poniatowa, already emptied of its Jewish labor population, no longer held central importance in the occupation system, yet its physical presence remained part of the regional landscape awaiting the outcome of military developments, and the SS administrative structure that had coordinated deportations, labor exploitation, and Operation Harvest Festival gradually shifted focus toward evacuation, concealment of evidence, and consolidation of resources, reflecting a broader pattern across occupied territories as retreat became increasingly probable. And although Poniatowa did not undergo the same scale of dismantling seen at extermination centers such as Treblinka or Sobibor earlier in 1943, efforts were made in various camps throughout the district to obscure evidence of mass killings, whether through covering burial sites or removing administrative records, underscoring awareness among authorities that the war's direction had changed, and as Soviet forces advanced during the summer of 1944, particularly during Operation Bagration, German positions in eastern Poland weakened significantly, leading to the liberation of Majdanek in July 1944, one of the first major concentration camps to fall into Allied hands largely intact, providing direct evidence of the camp system's operations, and the liberation of the Lublin region soon followed, bringing Soviet troops into areas that had previously been under SS control, including the vicinity of Poniatowa, and with the collapse of German authority in the district, administrative continuity that had sustained the camp system for years abruptly ended, replaced by military occupation and the initial stages of post-war investigation. And for Poniatowa, this meant that the rural compound, once embedded within a disciplined hierarchy, now stood under new control, its wooden barracks and fenced boundaries representing remnants of a system that had disintegrated under military defeat, and local residents who had lived near the camp witnessed this transition from structured occupation to liberation, though the full scope of what had occurred during November 1943 would take time to reconstruct, and the shift from German control to Soviet administration marked the beginning of a new chapter in the site's history, one in which documentation, testimony, and material evidence would gradually be examined within the broader effort to record and interpret the crimes committed across occupied Poland, and thus Chapter 7 moves from immediate aftermath to geopolitical transformation, illustrating how the fate of Poniatowa was ultimately bound to the trajectory of the war itself, as advancing front lines dissolved the authority that had shaped its operation and opened the path toward post-war reckoning, linking the quiet fields of eastern Poland to the wider collapse of the Nazi occupation system in 1944. Chapter 7, Segment 3. Liberation of the region and the first encounters with evidence. When Soviet forces advanced into the Lublin district in the summer of 1944, the collapse of German occupation authority unfolded rapidly, and territories that had for years been governed through layered SS administration, police enforcement, and bureaucratic precision came under new control within weeks. And this transformation altered the status of sites such as Poniatowa, which no longer functioned as camps but remained marked by the physical traces of their former purpose. Because although the Jewish labor population at Poniatowa had been eliminated in November 1943, the structures themselves, barracks, guard towers, fencing, and internal pathways, were still present when the region was liberated, standing as silent evidence of a system that had only recently dissolved. And in July 1944, the Red Army liberated Majdanek near Lublin, uncovering one of the first major concentration camps largely intact, providing immediate physical confirmation of mass imprisonment and killing on a scale previously difficult to document. And as Soviet units moved through surrounding districts, including the area of Poniatowa, they encountered additional sites where evidence of detention and execution required investigation. And although Poniatowa did not present the same preserved infrastructure as Majdanek, burial grounds associated with Operation Harvest Festival remained within the landscape, and early Soviet investigative commissions began documenting testimony from local residents and gathering material evidence, initiating a process that would contribute to broader post-war understanding of events in the Lublin district. And the liberation of the region did not instantly resolve questions about what had occurred, as wartime chaos, destroyed records, and the absence of surviving prisoner populations complicated reconstruction. Yet the existence of administrative files, some recovered from district offices, combined with witness accounts, gradually clarified the sequence of events leading to November 1943, and for nearby communities the transition from occupation to Soviet administration introduced new political realities. As authority shifted and the war's devastation became more visible, and sites like Poniatowa entered a phase of historical reinterpretation, no longer functioning installations but locations tied to memory and investigation, and the contrast between the quiet rural surroundings and the knowledge of mass killing embedded within the soil created a landscape marked by absence rather than activity, underscoring how quickly occupation structures had disappeared once German control collapsed. And in the immediate post-liberation months, documentation efforts were shaped by Soviet priorities, emphasizing the exposure of Nazi crimes while also integrating findings into wartime propaganda and judicial preparation, laying groundwork for subsequent trials and commemorations. And thus the liberation of the Lublin district marked not only The military end of German authority, but the beginning of formal acknowledgement of the crimes committed within its camps, linking Poniatowa to the expanding body of evidence that defined global understanding of the Holocaust, and transforming a former labor installation into a site of historical inquiry, where physical remnants, burial grounds, and archival records would collectively inform the narrative of Operation Harvest Festival and the broader structure of Action Reinhard in occupied Poland. Chapter 7, Segment 4. Documentation, Testimony, and Early Investigations. In the months following the liberation of the Lublin district in 1944, the process of documenting what had occurred at sites such as Poniatowa began within a broader framework of Soviet-led investigations into Nazi crimes, and although the camp itself no longer functioned as an active detention site, the physical traces of its layered history, wooden barracks, burial grounds associated with Operation Harvest Festival, and scattered administrative remnants, became subjects of formal inquiry. Because the scale of killing carried out across the district required systematic examination to establish both historical record and legal accountability, and investigative commissions gathered statements from local residents who had observed aspects of camp operation or the events of November 1943, supplementing these testimonies with physical inspection of burial areas where thousands had been killed. And while many original SS records had been removed, destroyed, or relocated during the German retreat, enough documentation survived at district levels to confirm the coordinated nature of Aktion Erntefest and the inclusion of Poniatowa alongside Majdanek and Trawniki in a synchronized action. And this early documentation phase was shaped by the priorities of the Soviet administration, which sought to publicize evidence of Nazi atrocities as part of the broader war narrative. Yet it also laid essential groundwork for post-war legal proceedings and historical research, because establishing prisoner numbers, execution dates, and command responsibility required careful correlation of testimony and surviving files. And in this context, Poniatowa was recognized not merely as a local tragedy, but as a component of a regional operation that represented the final stage of Action Reinhard in eastern Poland. And as investigations continued into 1945 and beyond, material evidence from the Lublin district contributed to the broader body of knowledge presented during international and national trials, reinforcing the understanding that Operation Harvest Festival constituted one of the largest single mass shooting operations of the Holocaust. And at Poniatowa itself, the physical landscape gradually shifted from operational site to place of remembrance, though immediate post-war years were marked by political transformation and reconstruction efforts that sometimes overshadowed localized commemoration. And yet the documentation collected during these early investigations ensured that the events of November 4, 1943 were recorded within official archives, preserving the names of perpetrators identified, the estimated number of victims, and the administrative chain that linked district command to camp execution. And this archival preservation became essential for later historians who would examine the structure of Action Reinhard in detail, reconstructing how labor camps were integrated into extermination policy and how bureaucratic coordination enabled synchronized killing across multiple sites. And thus Chapter 7's focus on documentation and testimony underscores that the end of German authority did not conclude the history of Poniatowa but initiated a new phase in which evidence was gathered, analyzed, and incorporated into the larger narrative of the Holocaust, transforming a rural compound once defined by surveillance and labor into a documented site of mass killing, whose story would continue to be studied, commemorated, and taught long after the war had ended and the structures of occupation had disappeared from eastern Poland. Chapter 7, Segment 5. Transition from site of control to site of memory. As the immediate post-liberation investigations settled into longer-term historical and judicial processes, Poniatowa entered a gradual transition from a former site of control into a place associated with memory and documentation. And this transition did not occur instantly or uniformly, because the broader political environment in post-war Poland influenced how former campsites were preserved, interpreted, or repurposed. Yet despite shifting political narratives, the essential historical facts of November 1943 remained embedded in archival records, witness testimonies, and the physical terrain itself, ensuring that Poniatowa would not disappear entirely from the documented history of the Holocaust. And during the late 1940s and 1950s, efforts were made in various parts of Poland to identify mass grave sites, mark burial areas, and incorporate locations connected to Aktion Reinhard into commemorative frameworks, though emphasis sometimes focused more prominently on larger or more intact camps such as Majdanek, which had been liberated with substantial infrastructure preserved, while smaller or partially altered sites like Poniatowa required sustained historical research to reconstruct their layered evolution from agricultural land to POW camp, then to Jewish labor installation, and finally to mass execution site. And over time, scholars examining the structure of Operation Harvest Festival relied on district records, post-war testimonies, and comparative analysis across Majdanek, Trawniki, and Poniatowa to clarify the scale and coordination of the two-day action in early November 1943, reinforcing recognition of Poniatowa as a central component of that operation rather than a peripheral episode. And as decades passed, the site itself became part of local and national remembrance practices, with memorial markers acknowledging the thousands who had been killed there, embedding historical acknowledgement within the landscape that once held barracks and fencing. And this evolution from controlled space to commemorative ground reflects a broader transformation experienced by many former camps across Europe, where physical remnants serve as anchors for historical education and reflection. And in the case of Poniatowa, the absence of surviving prisoners following Operation Harvest Festival intensified reliance on documentation and external testimony to reconstruct events, underscoring the importance of early investigative efforts undertaken after liberation, and thus the site's post-war identity has been shaped by layered memory, local awareness of the events of November 1943, national commemoration of Holocaust victims, and scholarly integration of Poniatowa into the narrative of Aktion Reinhardt's final phase, linking the quiet fields of eastern Poland to one of the largest coordinated mass shootings of the war. And in this way, Chapter 7 concludes by emphasizing that although the camp's operational life ended abruptly in 1943, its historical life continued through documentation, investigation, and remembrance, transforming a landscape once defined by surveillance and coercion into a place where the silence that followed has been interpreted not as erasure, but as a solemn reminder of the thousands whose lives were confined within its perimeter and ended during Operation Harvest Festival, ensuring that Poniatowa remains part of the enduring record of the Holocaust and the structured policies that shaped its tragic course. In the Lublin District, Chapter 8, Segment 1. Post-war accountability and the search for responsibility. After the collapse of German occupation authority in the Lublin district in 1944 and the subsequent end of the war in 1945, attention gradually shifted from documentation of events to questions of legal responsibility, and in this broader context, Poniatowa became part of a larger judicial effort to identify, prosecute, and assess those who had participated in the administration and execution of policies that culminated in Operation Harvest Festival, because the coordinated killing of approximately 42,000 Jews across Majdanek, Trawniki, and Poniatowa on the 3rd and the 4th of November 1943 was not an anonymous act but the result of decisions made within identifiable chains of command, linking district-level leadership to camp personnel and auxiliary units. And the first major proceedings addressing crimes in the Lublin district took place in the immediate post-war years under Polish and Soviet jurisdiction, as well as later in German courts, where investigations sought to determine the roles played by SS officers, administrative officials, and guards assigned to camps in the region, and within this process the name of Odilo Globoknik, the SS and police leader in Lublin who had overseen Aktion Reinhardt, emerged prominently, though he evaded trial by committing suicide in May 1945 after capture by British forces, illustrating the incomplete nature of early accountability efforts. And other officials connected to the district were investigated and, in some cases, prosecuted for their involvement in deportations, forced labor administration, and mass shootings. Though legal proceedings often face challenges related to destroyed records, the dispersal of personnel across post-war Europe, and the passage of time, and in the case of Operation Harvest Festival specifically, Courts examined evidence linking camp commandants and security units to the coordinated executions, relying on surviving documentation, testimonies from local witnesses, and records recovered from district offices to reconstruct events. And while not all perpetrators were identified or convicted, the judicial record established recognition of the synchronized nature of the killings and affirmed Poniatowa's role within that operation, embedding the camp within formal legal acknowledgement of Nazi crimes. And these proceedings formed part of a broader pattern of post-war accountability that extended from the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg to subsequent national trials in Poland and Germany, where prosecutors sought to demonstrate that extermination and mass shooting operations were products of organized policy rather than isolated acts. And thus Poniatowa entered the historical record not only as a site of memory but as evidence within legal frameworks that addressed crimes against humanity. And the slow pace of some investigations underscored the complexity of attributing responsibility within hierarchical systems where orders flowed through multiple layers of command. Yet the very existence of trials signaled a departure from the impunity that had characterized the occupation period, affirming that the events of November 1943 were subject to scrutiny and judgment in peacetime. And as decades progressed, renewed investigations in Germany during the 1960s and later examined the broader structure of Aktion Reinhard, revisiting evidence connected to camps in the Lublin district, reinforcing scholarly and judicial recognition of Poniatowa's place within that structure. And thus Chapter 8 begins by tracing how accountability efforts extended the history of the camp beyond its physical closure, linking the quiet fields of eastern Poland to courtrooms and archival repositories where testimony and documentation sought to assign responsibility, ensuring that the administrative precision that once enabled Operation Harvest Festival would later be examined as evidence in the pursuit of justice, even if that justice remained partial and incomplete in light of the scale of the crime. Chapter 8, Segment 2. Trials in Poland and Germany and the Limits of Justice. In the years following the Second World War, the effort to establish accountability for crimes committed in the Lublin district unfolded across multiple legal jurisdictions, reflecting both the geographic dispersal of perpetrators and the political realities of post-war Europe. And in Poland, early trials were conducted against captured camp personnel and collaborators who had served in concentration and labor camps, including those associated with Majdanek and other sites connected to Aktion Reinhard. And while Poniatowa itself did not become the singular focus of a major standalone trial in the immediate aftermath, evidence regarding Operation Harvest Festival was presented within broader prosecutions that addressed coordinated mass shootings across the district, establishing in court records that the killings on the 3rd and the 4th of November 1943 were synchronized actions directed from district-level command rather than spontaneous violence at individual camps. And these early Polish proceedings relied heavily on witness testimony from local residents, recovered documentation, and investigative reports compiled shortly after liberation, contributing to an official record that affirmed the scale of the killings and the structured hierarchy under which they were executed. And in parallel, the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg in 1945 and 1946 addressed crimes committed by the leadership of the Nazi regime, framing the extermination of Jews as a central component of state policy, thereby contextualizing events such as Operation Harvest Festival within the larger structure of the Holocaust. Though many mid-level and lower-ranking officials associated with specific camps were not immediately brought to trial at that stage, and in the Federal Republic of Germany renewed judicial interest in Nazi crimes during the late 1950s and 1960s led to investigations and prosecutions that examined Aktion Reinhard in detail, including the roles of SS officers in camp personnel stationed in the Lublin district. And during these proceedings, courts faced challenges related to evidentiary gaps, the passage of time, and legal standards requiring proof of individual intent or direct participation, which often limited the scope of convictions. Yet the testimony and archival research undertaken during these trials expanded historical understanding of how labor camps like Poniatowa were integrated into extermination policy and how Operation Harvest Festival was organized across multiple sites, and while not every individual responsible for events at Poniatowa was identified or convicted, the legal record affirmed recognition of the coordinated killings as criminal acts under international and domestic law, embedding the camp's history within jurisprudence that addressed crimes against humanity. And this gradual judicial process highlights both the importance and the limitations of post-war justice, because accountability was pursued within legal frameworks that required evidence and procedure, yet many perpetrators evaded prosecution due to death, flight, or insufficient documentation, and nonetheless, the cumulative effect of trials in Poland and Germany ensured that Poniatowa's role in Operation Harvest Festival was not obscured, linking its name to court transcripts, investigative reports, and scholarly analysis that reinforced its place within the documented narrative of the Holocaust. And thus Chapter 8 continues by emphasizing that legal reckoning extended the historical life of the camp beyond 1943, transforming administrative records once used to track labor and execution into instruments of testimony and judgment, and contributing to the broader effort to confront and interpret the crimes committed within the quiet rural landscape of eastern Poland during the final phase of Action Reinhard. Chapter 8, Segment 3: Historical Research and the Reconstruction of Events. Beyond the courtroom, the understanding of what occurred at Poniatowa during Operation Harvest Festival has been shaped extensively by decades of historical research, archival analysis, and comparative study of Action Reinhard sites across the Lublin district. Because while early post-war investigations established the basic outline of the coordinated killings of the 3rd and the 4th of November 1943, subsequent scholars sought to reconstruct the internal functioning of the camp, its population dynamics, administrative integration, and its final transformation with greater precision, drawing upon a combination of surviving German documents, Polish and Soviet investigative files, witness testimonies, and material evidence gathered at burial sites. And this layered reconstruction has clarified that Poniatowa was not an isolated installation but part of a network that included Majdanek, Trawniki, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, each playing a distinct role within Action Reinhardt's evolving structure, and researchers have examined how the camp transitioned from a Soviet prisoner of war facility in 1941 to a Jewish textile labor camp in 1942, integrating thousands of deportees from liquidated ghettos, particularly Warsaw, into production systems that temporarily aligned economic exploitation with ideological policy, before concluding in the synchronized mass shooting that eliminated approximately 14,000 to 15,000 people in a single day, and through comparative analysis. Historians have been able to situate Operation Harvest Festival as the largest single mass shooting action of the Holocaust, with an estimated total of about 42,000 victims across 3 sites in 2 days, demonstrating the scale and coordination achieved by district-level SS leadership. And scholarly inquiry has also addressed the logistical planning behind the operation, including the preparation of execution trenches, the deployment of additional guard units, and the sequencing of actions to prevent warning between camps, illustrating how administrative precision enabled rapid implementation. And in examining Poniatowa specifically, historians have explored the social composition of its prisoner population, the conditions of forced labor in textile workshops, and the fragile belief among prisoners that continued productivity might prolong survival, thereby restoring to the historical record the lived dimension that administrative files alone could not convey. And the integration of survivor accounts from those who had been transferred prior to November 1943 or who escaped earlier phases has further enriched understanding of the camp's daily routine and internal organization, ensuring that Poniatowa is remembered not solely as a site of finality, but as a place where a structured community existed under coercion before being destroyed. And modern scholarship has increasingly emphasized the importance of regional studies in understanding the Holocaust, recognizing that examining individual sites such as Poniatowa reveals how national policy was implemented locally through spatial design, bureaucratic oversight, and disciplined enforcement. And thus the work of historians has transformed the quiet fields of eastern Poland into a documented chapter within the broader narrative of genocide, ensuring that the administrative clarity once used to manage exploitation and execution is now used to illuminate and analyze. And in this way, Chapter 8 underscores that historical research serves as a form of accountability parallel to legal proceedings, preserving evidence, contextualizing events, and integrating Poniatowa into the comprehensive study of Aktion Reinhard and the Holocaust as a whole, so that its history remains accessible, examined, and understood within an ever-expanding body of scholarly work dedicated to confronting the structured violence of the past. Chapter 8, Segment 4: Memory, Commemoration, and the Shaping of Public Understanding. As decades passed after the end of the Second World War, the history of Poniatowa gradually entered not only legal records and scholarly analysis but also the sphere of public memory, where sites connected to Aktion Reinhard were recognized as places requiring commemoration, reflection, and education. And although Poniatowa did not retain the extensive preserved infrastructure seen at Majdanek, its role in Operation Harvest Festival ensured that it remained part of the broader landscape of Holocaust remembrance in Poland, because the estimated 14,000 to 15,000 victims killed there on November 4, 1943 represented a significant portion of the approximately 42,000 murdered during the two-day coordinated action across the Lublin district, and as memorial culture developed in post-war Poland, markers and commemorative elements were established at former camp locations, acknowledging burial sites and identifying them as places of mass killing, embedding recognition into the terrain itself, and over time historical publications, museum exhibitions, and educational programs incorporated Poniatowa into discussions of Aktion Reinhardt's final phase, emphasizing the synchronized nature of Operation Harvest Festival and situating the camp within the structured sequence that moved from ghetto liquidation to forced labor exploitation and ultimately to coordinated elimination, and the shaping of public understanding has been influenced by evolving approaches to Holocaust memory, which increasingly emphasize regional specificity and the importance of recognizing smaller or less architecturally preserved sites alongside more widely known camps, ensuring that the narrative does not concentrate solely on a limited number of locations but reflects the distributed geography of genocide. And in this context, Poniatowa serves as a reminder that mass killing occurred not only in extermination centers with gas chambers but also through organized mass shootings conducted within labor camp environments, demonstrating the varied methods through which policy was implemented, and commemorative practices at the site encourage reflection on the layered history of the land, tracing its transformation from agricultural fields to prisoner of war camp, to textile labor installation, and finally to mass execution ground, highlighting how ordinary landscapes were reshaped by administrative decisions during occupation and educational initiatives. Often connect Poniatowa to broader discussions of Aktion Reinhard, using maps, archival photographs, and testimony to illustrate how district-level leadership coordinated actions across Majdanek, Trawniki, and Poniatowa within a narrow time frame, reinforcing awareness of the scale and organization involved. And as historical memory has matured, the emphasis has shifted from immediate post-war documentation to sustained engagement with ethical and educational questions about how to represent sites of mass killing respectfully and accurately, aligning with contemporary standards of Holocaust remembrance that prioritize dignity, factual precision, and reflection rather than sensationalism. And thus the memory of Poniatowa today exists at the intersection of local landscape and global history, linking the quiet rural environment of Eastern Poland to international awareness of the Holocaust, and ensuring that the events of November 4, 1943 are not confined to archival records but remain part of public consciousness, where remembrance serves as acknowledgement of those whose lives were ended within its perimeter, and as a reminder of how structured policy and administrative coordination can transform ordinary places into sites of irreversible loss. Chapter 8, Segment 5: The Ethical Responsibility of Remembering. As the decades have continued to pass since the events of November 1943, the responsibility associated with places like Poniatowa has increasingly shifted toward historical education, ethical reflection, and preservation of memory, because while the physical structures that once defined the camp have largely disappeared or changed over time, the historical significance of the site endures through documentation, scholarship, and commemoration, and the recognition of Poniatowa as one of the central locations of Operation Harvest Festival situates it within a broader moral landscape that extends beyond regional history into global understanding of the Holocaust. And remembrance in this context is not an abstract concept but an active process that depends upon continued research, responsible storytelling, and acknowledgement of the individuals whose lives were confined within the camp's perimeter before being ended in a coordinated action, and the estimated 14 to 15,000 victims at Poniatowa represent not only statistical figures within the approximately 42,000 murdered during the two-day operation across the Lublin district, but also members of communities that had once existed across eastern Poland, particularly from Warsaw and surrounding ghettos, whose displacement and forced labor preceded their final confinement. And in preserving the history of Poniatowa, educators and historians emphasize the structured progression that led to its final transformation, tracing how occupation policy moved step by step from segregation to deportation, from exploitation to elimination, reinforcing the importance of understanding genocide not as sudden eruption but as a sequence of administrative decisions implemented through disciplined hierarchy and spatial control. And memorialization efforts at former campsites aim to ensure that silence does not translate into forgetting, but instead becomes a space for contemplation, where visitors encounter markers that identify burial grounds and reflect upon the scale of loss embedded in otherwise quiet rural surroundings. And this act of remembering aligns with contemporary approaches to Holocaust education that prioritize accuracy, respect, and avoidance of sensationalism, recognizing that sites like Poniatowa demand careful narration grounded in documented fact, and the ethical dimension of remembrance also includes confronting the broader implications of how bureaucratic systems can be mobilized toward destructive ends, illustrating that the structures once used to register labor quotas and organize production were equally capable of coordinating mass killing. A lesson that extends beyond the historical moment into ongoing discussions about responsibility and governance, and thus the legacy of Poniatowa is not confined to its brief existence as a camp between 1941 and 1943 but continues through the work of archivists, scholars, educators, and communities who maintain its memory, ensuring that the transformation of agricultural land into a site of forced labor and mass execution remains part of the documented narrative of the Holocaust. And as Chapter 8 concludes, the emphasis rests on the enduring obligation to remember and to teach, so that the quiet fields of eastern Poland, once enclosed by wire and watchtowers, remain recognized as ground marked by history, where the structured policies of Aktion Reinhard reached their final phase and where remembrance serves as both acknowledgement and warning for future generations. Chapter 9, Segment 1. The Physical Remnants and the Changing Landscape. In the decades after the war, the physical landscape of Poniatowa continued to evolve, shaped by natural processes, local development, and shifting approaches to preservation. And yet beneath these changes the ground retained its historical significance, because although many of the original wooden barracks and camp structures did not survive intact into the later 20th century, the spatial memory of the site remained embedded in the terrain, and efforts to identify and mark burial areas associated with Operation Harvest Festival ensured that the central fact of November 4, 1943 would not be lost within rural transformation. And as post-war reconstruction progressed in eastern Poland, practical considerations often determined the fate of former camp structures, with some materials repurposed and others deteriorating over time, reflecting the utilitarian reality of a region rebuilding after years of occupation and conflict. Yet even as visible elements faded, archival documentation and investigative records preserved the outlines of the camp's layout, enabling historians to reconstruct how the perimeter fencing, roll call square, workshops, and housing barracks had once been arranged across the landscape, and archaeological and commemorative initiatives in later years sought to align physical markers with documented evidence, identifying locations of mass graves and situating memorial plaques or monuments in proximity to burial sites, reinforcing the connection between land and history, and the transformation of the site from controlled camp to open terrain illustrates how physical space can absorb layers of meaning over time, shifting from agricultural field to prisoner of war compound, to Jewish labor installation, to execution ground, and finally to memorial landscape, each phase altering perception without entirely erasing what came before, and visitors to the site today encounter an environment that appears outwardly calm, with fields and vegetation forming a quiet horizon similar to that which surrounded the camp during its operation. Yet this calm carries historical weight, because beneath the surface lie the remains of thousands killed during Operation Harvest Festival, linking the present landscape to the structured violence of 1943, and the absence of extensive preserved infrastructure at Poniatowa compared to larger sites such as Majdanek underscores the importance of documentation in sustaining historical awareness, as memory relies not only on visible buildings but on recorded testimony and archival reconstruction. And over time, local communities have incorporated the site into broader narratives of wartime history, acknowledging its role within the Lublin district's network of camps and its place in the final phase of Aktion Reinhard, ensuring that it remains recognized even as physical traces diminish. And thus Chapter 9 begins by examining how the material remnants of Poniatowa intersect with natural change and human development, demonstrating that the passage of time alters the appearance of places without dissolving their historical significance, and that the quiet fields of eastern Poland continue to hold within their soil the memory of a structured system that once confined, exploited, and ultimately eliminated thousands within a coordinated action that closed one of the darkest chapters of the region's history. Chapter 9, Segment 2: Archaeological Traces and the Work of Preservation. As the visible structures of Poniatowa gradually diminished over the decades, the responsibility of preserving its history increasingly relied upon careful documentation of the ground itself, because although wooden barracks and fencing deteriorated or were removed, the subsurface traces of camp layout and burial sites remained embedded in the soil, and modern archaeological and historical efforts have sought to identify these traces with sensitivity and precision, recognizing that former execution grounds and mass graves require respectful treatment aligned with commemorative principles, and researchers working in the broader Lublin district have applied comparative methods developed at other Aktion Reinhard sites, examining aerial photographs, wartime maps, post-war investigative reports, and survivor or witness testimonies to approximate the original boundaries and functional zones of camps like Poniatowa, and through such interdisciplinary work the outlines of the roll call square, housing clusters, and workshop areas can be reconstructed even when physical remnants are sparse, reinforcing the understanding that spatial memory survives beyond architecture, and particular attention has been directed toward burial areas associated with Operation Harvest Festival, where thousands were killed on November 4, 1943, because these locations represent both historical evidence and sacred ground, and preservation efforts emphasize non-invasive documentation techniques, whenever possible, such as ground-penetrating radar and careful mapping, to confirm the extent of burial trenches without disturbing remains, aligning with contemporary ethical standards that prioritize dignity and respect for victims. And in parallel, local and national institutions have collaborated to install or maintain memorial markers at identified sites, ensuring that visitors encounter clear acknowledgement of what occurred there, even if they do not see preserved barracks or guard towers. And the absence of large-scale architectural remnants at Poniatowa has shaped the nature of preservation, focusing less on reconstructing buildings and more on protecting terrain and educating about layered transformation, tracing how agricultural land was reorganized into camp grid, how workshops operated within adapted structures, and how execution trenches were prepared in advance for the synchronized action of November 1943. And this approach underscores that preservation is not limited to visible artifacts but includes safeguarding memory through research, signage, archival publication and public awareness, and the work of historians and archaeologists at Poniatowa contributes to a broader effort across Europe to identify and protect sites connected to mass shooting operations, recognizing that many such locations lack monumental architecture yet carry profound historical significance. And thus Chapter 9 continues by highlighting how the land itself functions as an archive, where soil composition, subsurface disturbances, and mapped coordinates intersect with written records to create a comprehensive understanding of place, ensuring that even as time alters the surface appearance of Poniatowa, its connection to Operation Harvest Festival and the approximately 14,000 to 15,000 victims killed their remains documented, respected, and integrated into the enduring narrative of Aktion Reinhard in the Lublin district. Chapter 9, Segment 3. Local Memory and the Presence of Absence. In addition to formal preservation efforts and scholarly research, the memory of Poniatowa has also been shaped by the lived awareness of local communities who have inhabited the surrounding region across generations. Because while national and international narratives of the Holocaust often focus on larger or more architecturally preserved sites, smaller locations such as Poniatowa exist within the daily geography of towns and villages where the land itself carries layered memory, and this presence of absence, the knowledge that thousands once lived and died within a now quiet field, forms a subtle but enduring element of local historical consciousness. And in the immediate post-war years, residents who had witnessed aspects of the camp's operation or the events of November 4, 1943 contributed testimony to investigative commissions, embedding personal recollection within official documentation. And over time, those direct witnesses gradually passed away, leaving subsequent generations to inherit both the physical landscape and the recorded history associated with it, and commemorative practices in the area have reflected this transition, incorporating memorial markers, annual remembrance events, and educational initiatives that acknowledge the victims of Operation Harvest Festival, ensuring that the site remains recognized even in the absence of extensive preserved infrastructure. And schools and local historical societies have at times included Poniatowa within broader discussions of wartime occupation in eastern Poland, connecting the camp's history to regional narratives of deportation, forced labor, and mass shooting, reinforcing awareness that the Holocaust unfolded not only in distant or isolated places but within familiar terrain. And the quiet rural environment that surrounds the former camp today underscores the contrast between present calm and past violence, creating a landscape where absence itself becomes meaningful as visitors encounter open space marked by signage or monuments rather than buildings, prompting reflection on how structured authority once transformed this ground into a site of confinement and execution. And the integration of Poniatowa into local memory also reflects broader shifts in how societies engage with difficult pasts, moving from periods of silence or limited acknowledgement toward more explicit commemoration aligned with international standards of Holocaust remembrance. And thus Chapter 9 emphasizes that preservation operates on multiple levels: archival, archaeological, educational, and communal, each contributing to sustained recognition of the approximately 14,000 to 15,000 victims killed there. And by examining the role of local memory, we see how history remains embedded not only in official records but in the identity of place, ensuring that the transformation of agricultural land into camp and execution site remains part of the regional narrative, linking the quiet fields of Eastern Poland to the structured policies of Aktion Reinhard and reinforcing the responsibility of present generations to maintain awareness of what occurred within that landscape during the final phase of 1943. Chapter 9, Segment 4. Poniatowa within the broader map of Aktion Reinhard. When examining the geography of Aktion Reinhard as a whole, Poniatowa occupies a distinct yet interconnected position within the network of camps and killing sites that defined the Lublin district between 1942 and 1943, and situating the camp within this broader map clarifies how regional coordination shaped its final chapter, because the district contained a layered system that included extermination centers such as Belzec and Sobibor, the concentration and killing complex at Majdanek, the training and labor camp at Trawniki, and labor installations such as Poniatowa that temporarily integrated economic exploitation into extermination policy, creating a spatial configuration in which each site fulfilled a designated role within an overarching administrative framework directed from Lublin, and during 1,942 deportations from ghettos across occupied Poland flowed primarily toward the extermination centers, while selected prisoners were diverted to labor camps based on perceived productivity, embedding Poniatowa into a system that functioned simultaneously as industrial network and detention structure. And by late 1943, when the majority of ghettos had been liquidated and extermination centers had largely ceased operation after fulfilling their primary purpose, the remaining Jewish populations were concentrated in camps such as Majdanek, Trawniki, and Poniatowa, making these sites the final nodes of Jewish existence within the district. And it was this concentration that prompted the synchronized action of Operation Harvest Festival on the 3rd and the 4th of November 1943, when district leadership coordinated executions across these 3 locations within 2 days, eliminating approximately 42,000 people in total, including 14 to 15,000 at Poniatowa. And understanding this coordinated structure underscores that the camp's destruction was not an isolated event but part of a planned regional consolidation intended to conclude Action Reinhard in eastern Poland, and the map of the district thus reveals a progression from dispersed ghettos to centralized killing centers, from labor exploitation to coordinated mass shooting, with Poniatowa representing the final phase of that trajectory. And when viewed within this spatial context, the quiet rural landscape today gains additional dimension because it was once linked administratively and operationally to other sites across the region, each connected by transportation routes, communication channels, and shared command hierarchy, illustrating how geography and policy were interwoven. And the preservation of Poniatowa as a memorial site therefore contributes not only to local remembrance but to a comprehensive understanding of Action Reinhard as a regional system, reminding observers that genocide unfolded through interconnected locations rather than singular isolated spaces, and thus Chapter 9 expands the lens outward, positioning Poniatowa within the broader cartography of the Holocaust in Poland, ensuring that its history is read alongside Majdanek and Trawniki as part of the final coordinated action that closed one of the most destructive chapters in the Lublin district during November 1943. Chapter 9, Segment 5. Enduring Landscape and the Responsibility of Continuity. As the physical traces of Poniatowa have continued to fade with time, what remains most enduring is the layered meaning carried by the landscape itself, because although the wooden barracks, guard towers, and workshop interiors that once defined the camp have largely disappeared, the ground retains historical weight, shaped by successive transformations that moved from agricultural field to prisoner of war compound, to Jewish labor installation, and finally to execution site during Operation Harvest Festival. And this layered transformation underscores how ordinary terrain can be redefined by policy and then return to quiet without erasing the past, creating a landscape that appears calm yet carries embedded memory. And the responsibility associated with such a site lies not only in maintaining physical markers, but in sustaining awareness through education, research, and commemoration, ensuring that the approximately 14 to 15,000 victims killed at Poniatowa on 4 November 1943 remain part of documented history rather than becoming abstract numbers detached from place, and contemporary approaches to Holocaust remembrance emphasize continuity of narrative, connecting local sites like Poniatowa to the broader structure of Action Reinhard and to global understanding of genocide, reinforcing that the events in the Lublin district were neither spontaneous nor isolated, but the result of coordinated administrative planning executed across multiple locations within a defined time frame, and thus preserving the memory of Poniatowa contributes to a larger historical framework that examines how bureaucratic systems, spatial organization, and disciplined hierarchy enabled mass violence, offering insight into mechanisms rather than focusing solely on outcomes. And visitors who stand at the site today encounter open land marked by memorial elements that invite reflection rather than spectacle, aligning with the principle that remembrance should be solemn and grounded in documented fact, and the quiet that characterizes the area now contrasts with the structured noise of workshops and roll calls that once filled it. Yet this quiet is not absence of meaning but presence of history, calling for continued stewardship so that the camp's layered evolution is neither forgotten nor simplified. And Chapter 9 concludes by emphasizing that continuity of memory depends on sustained engagement. As archives are preserved, research updated, and educational initiatives maintained across generations, linking the rural fields of eastern Poland to the broader narrative of the Holocaust, and ensuring that Poniatowa remains recognized as one of the final sites of Aktion Reinhard, where the structured progression from detention to labor to elimination reached its decisive end in November 1943, and where the enduring landscape now serves as a reminder of how administrative precision and ideological policy once reshaped ordinary ground into a place of irreversible loss. Chapter 10, Segment 1. Returning to the ground. Today, when one stands on the land where Poniatowa once operated as a prisoner of war camp and later as a Jewish forced labor installation, the first impression is not of structures or machinery but of openness, because the wooden barracks that once formed rigid rows have largely disappeared. The guard towers no longer cast shadows across fenced boundaries, and the internal pathways that directed thousands from roll call square to textile workshops have faded back into ordinary terrain. Yet, beneath this apparent simplicity lies a layered history that cannot be seen directly but can be understood through careful reconstruction, and returning to the ground invites reflection on how space itself absorbed successive transformations between 1941 and 1943, moving from agricultural landscape to detention facility, to industrial labor site, and finally to execution ground during Operation Harvest Festival. And this progression was not chaotic but structured, shaped by administrative directives issued within the Lublin district under SS authority, embedding policy into wood, wire, and measured alignment across fields that had once followed seasonal rhythms alone. And in November 1943, approximately 14,000 to 15,000 people were killed here in a single day as part of the synchronized action that also struck Majdanek and Trawniki, bringing the total number of victims across those 2 days to roughly 42,000, marking the final consolidation of Aktion Reinhard in eastern Poland, and the land retains that history even when no visible barracks remain, because the burial areas prepared in advance for the executions remain beneath the soil, protected and marked to acknowledge the lives ended there. And the contrast between present quiet and past structure underscores how quickly authority can redefine ordinary ground, transforming it into a controlled environment where daily routine is regulated by hierarchy and documentation, and then, just as quickly, emptying it of human presence through coordinated directive. And reflecting upon this space emphasizes the importance of understanding not only the outcome of events but the mechanisms that made them possible, including bureaucratic precision, layered command structures, and spatial organization designed for surveillance and containment. And returning to the ground also highlights the continuity of nature, as fields continue to grow and seasons continue to change, reminding observers that landscapes endure beyond the systems imposed upon them, even as they carry memory within their soil. And thus Chapter 10 begins by situating the present within the past, inviting a quiet acknowledgement that the land itself has witnessed each phase of Poniatowa's transformation, from structured confinement to silent memorial, and that understanding this layered history requires attention to both what is visible today and what occurred beneath and within this space during the final months of 1943, ensuring that the ground is not viewed as empty but recognized as marked by the structured policies that once reshaped it and the thousands whose lives were ended here during Operation Harvest Festival. Chapter 10, Segment 2. Historical Continuity and the Lessons of Structure. Reflecting on Poniatowa in its entirety requires looking beyond the final day of November 4th, 1943 and tracing the structured progression that defined its existence from 1941 onward, because the camp did not emerge suddenly as a site of mass killing but developed through successive administrative phases that reveal how policy can reshape land and human life step by step, beginning with its establishment as a prisoner of war facility for captured Soviet soldiers after the German invasion of the Soviet Union, then shifting in 1942 into a Jewish forced labor camp integrated into the textile production network of the Lublin district, and finally concluding during Operation Harvest Festival as one of the principal sites of coordinated mass shooting that brought Aktion Reinhard to its regional end. And this continuity of transformation underscores that genocide operates not only through moments of violence but through systems of organization that normalize confinement, classification, and exploitation before culminating in elimination and the physical layout of Poniatowa. Its ordered barracks, roll call square, controlled gates, and guard towers was not merely background but active framework, enabling administrators to track prisoner numbers, assign labor quotas, and later coordinate executions with precision, illustrating how bureaucratic efficiency and spatial planning intersected within a rural environment that had once followed agricultural rhythms alone. And examining this structure offers broader historical insight because it demonstrates that destructive policy often relies upon routine, documentation, and hierarchy as much as overt force, embedding authority into daily life until transformation appears procedural rather than abrupt. And in the case of Poniatowa, the illusion of stability created by months of textile production masked the vulnerability of those confined, whose continued usefulness did not alter the ideological objectives that ultimately determined their fate, and thus the lessons drawn from this site extend beyond its specific geography, highlighting how administrative systems can be mobilized toward harmful ends when guided by exclusionary ideology and insulated from accountability. And today, the absence of barracks and machinery reinforces the importance of sustained historical study, because without careful reconstruction, the layered progression from labor camp to execution ground could fade into abstraction, detached from the physical terrain that made it possible. And by situating Poniatowa within the broader map of Aktion Reinhard, alongside Majdanek, Trawniki, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, we recognize how regional coordination amplified impact, culminating in the killing of approximately 14,000 to 15,000 people here within a single day, part of the roughly 42,000 murdered during the two-day operation across the district. And reflecting on this continuity emphasizes the responsibility to examine not only what happened but how it was organized, ensuring that the structured mechanisms that enabled such transformation remain subjects of careful historical analysis. And thus Chapter 10 continues by drawing attention to the interplay between land, administration, and ideology, reminding us that Poniatowa's history is not only a record of loss but also a case study in how ordinary environments can be absorbed into systematic policy, and how understanding that process remains essential to preventing repetition in future contexts. Chapter 10, Segment 3. The Silence of the Present and the Weight of Memory. In the present day, the site of Poniatowa rests within a quiet rural setting that offers little immediate indication of the layered events that unfolded there between 1941 and 1943. And yet this silence is not emptiness but a different form of presence, because the absence of visible barracks and watchtowers contrasts with the knowledge preserved through archives, testimony, and scholarship, creating a landscape in which memory depends upon awareness rather than spectacle. And walking across the open ground today, one encounters fields, vegetation, and sky much as they would have appeared before the camp was constructed. And this continuity of natural environment underscores how swiftly structured authority once overlaid ordinary terrain with fencing, grid alignment, and surveillance, transforming agricultural land into a prisoner of war camp, then into a textile labor installation holding thousands of Jewish deportees, and finally into a site of coordinated execution during Operation Harvest Festival, when approximately 14,000 to 15,000 people were killed here on November 4, 1943 as part of the two-day action across the Lublin district that claimed roughly 42,000 lives. And the weight of this history is carried not through dramatic ruins but through documentation and commemoration that identify burial grounds and acknowledge the structured process that led to that day. And this absence of monumental architecture invites a quieter reflection, aligned with the principle that remembrance should be respectful, grounded, and attentive to the dignity of those whose lives were ended, rather than focused on visual impact. And the silence of the present also reminds us that the camp's existence was relatively brief yet devastating, its operational phases compressed into 2 years that moved from detention to exploitation to elimination under administrative direction. And reflecting upon this progression encourages an understanding of history as layered and cumulative, rather than episodic, emphasizing that the events at Poniatowa were embedded within broader regional and ideological frameworks that shaped the Lublin district during the Holocaust. And today memorial markers serve as anchors for that awareness, guiding visitors to recognize that beneath the calm surface lies soil that holds the memory of thousands, and that the transformation of this ground was neither spontaneous nor isolated, but part of a coordinated policy, executed with bureaucratic precision. And in acknowledging this, we return not to spectacle but to responsibility, understanding that the preservation of sites like Poniatowa depends on continued study, teaching, and reflection, ensuring that the silence is interpreted as solemn recognition rather than forgetting. And thus Chapter 10 deepens its return to the ground by emphasizing that the present landscape is inseparable from its past, and that the quiet fields of eastern Poland stand as enduring witnesses to a structured system that once reshaped them, reminding future generations of the importance of memory, documentation, and vigilance in the face of ideologies capable of transforming ordinary spaces into sites of irreversible loss. Chapter 10, Segment 4. Reflection, Continuity, and the Meaning of Remembrance. As we move toward the closing reflections on Poniatowa, it becomes clear that the significance of this site lies not only in the events of November 4, 1943, but in the structured progression that preceded that day, because the transformation of open land into a prisoner of war facility, then into a Jewish forced labor camp integrated into textile production, and finally into a site of coordinated mass shooting reveals how administrative systems, spatial organization, and ideological direction converged over time, embedding policy into routine until its final expression unfolded with calculated precision. And reflecting upon this continuity encourages an understanding of history that is attentive to process as well as outcome, recognizing that the approximately 14,000 to 15,000 people killed at Poniatowa during Operation Harvest Festival were confined within a system that had first categorized, registered, and exploited them before eliminating them, and that this system operated through documentation, hierarchy, and disciplined enforcement rather than through spontaneous violence alone. And the land today, quiet and unadorned, invites contemplation of that progression, because without visible barracks or guard towers, the responsibility shifts to memory and education to preserve awareness of what occurred, and memorial markers at the site serve as anchors, identifying burial areas and acknowledging the victims while maintaining a solemn tone aligned with contemporary standards of respectful commemoration. And in the broader historical map of Aktion Reinhard, Poniatowa stands alongside Majdanek and Trawniki as one of the final nodes of a coordinated operation that claimed roughly 42,000 lives in 2 days, closing the regional phase of extermination policy in the Lublin district. And understanding this connection reinforces that the camp story is not isolated but embedded within a wider structure of occupation governance that linked multiple sites through shared command and synchronized timing. And reflecting upon Poniatowa therefore involves both local awareness and regional context, ensuring that its memory contributes to comprehensive understanding of how genocide was organized, implemented, and concluded in Eastern Poland. And as time continues to pass and direct witnesses are no longer present, the continuity of remembrance depends upon sustained historical scholarship, responsible narration, and the preservation of documented evidence, transforming what might otherwise become forgotten terrain into recognized ground marked by irreversible loss. And thus this reflection is not an ending in itself but part of an ongoing commitment to maintain clarity about the structured nature of the policies that reshaped this landscape, reminding us that remembrance requires attention, care, and continuity so that the silence of the present does not obscure the complexity of the past. Chapter 10, Segment 5. Closing reflection and enduring responsibility. The story of Poniatowa begins with land and returns to land. Before fences were raised and barracks aligned in ordered rows, this was agricultural ground shaped by seasonal work and rural rhythm. Between 1941 and 1943, that ground was absorbed into a structured system of occupation. It became a prisoner of war camp. It became a Jewish forced labor installation integrated into textile production. And on November 4, 1943, it became one of the principal sites of Operation Harvest Festival, where approximately 14,000 to 15,000 people were killed in a single coordinated action, part of the roughly 42,000 murdered across the Lublin district in 2 days. What makes Poniatowa historically significant is not only the scale of loss but the structure through which that loss occurred. The camp did not operate outside administration. It was embedded within it. Prisoners were registered. Labor was categorized. Production quotas were recorded. Security was layered and hierarchical. Orders moved through defined chains of command. The same bureaucratic precision that measured textile output later measured the completion of an execution operation. This progression reminds us that catastrophic outcomes often emerge from systems that appear orderly. Routine can mask vulnerability. Documentation can conceal intent. Administrative language can distance action from consequence. At Poniatowa, months of regulated labor created the fragile impression of continuity. Yet policy was shifting beyond the fences. When that policy changed, the structured environment allowed rapid implementation. Today, the visible structures are gone. The roll call square is no longer marked by formation lines. The workshops no longer echo with machinery. Guard towers no longer define the skyline. The perimeter fencing no longer separates enclosure from countryside. What remains is landscape, soil, sky, silence. But this silence carries weight. Beneath the ground lie burial areas connected to November 1943. Within archives lie registration lists, transport records, district directives, investigative reports, and post-war testimony. Within scholarship lies the reconstructed narrative of how Poniatowa fit into the larger structure of Aktion Reinhard. Within memorial practice lies acknowledgement of the victims whose names, in many cases, were lost to administrative reduction. Remembering Poniatowa does not require spectacle. It requires clarity. It requires understanding that this was one site within a regional network that included Majdanek and Trawniki, connected by shared command and synchronized timing. It requires recognition that genocide unfolded through structure, coordination, and calculated decision-making, not through disorder alone. When we return, in reflection, to the present landscape, we encounter fields that appear calm. The horizon is open. The air is still. Yet history remains here. The land has absorbed transformation and returned to quiet, but it has not erased what occurred. Today, the ground is quiet, but the history remains, and remembering is part of understanding. If you value complete, long-form Holocaust history told respectfully and carefully, consider subscribing, so that the stories of places like Poniatowa continue to be studied, remembered, and preserved with the seriousness they deserve. Today, the ground at Poniatowa is quiet. The barracks are gone. The fences no longer stand. But the history remains beneath the soil, and in the record we continue to preserve. Remembering is part of understanding that if you value complete, respectful, long-form Holocaust history told with care, consider subscribing so these stories continue to be documented and remembered.